When you look at a review, typically you're looking for an objective overview of something. You want to know if this gadget works properly, or what sort of defects are being reported with the latest and greatest vehicle. Same thing can be said when looking at media or art, but there's an issue with that. It's nigh impossible to objectify an experience. One person could greatly enjoy something while the other despises it. That's not to say you have to be on one extreme or the other, but stronger emotions tend to speak more loudly. When looking at video games, objectivity oftentimes comes from personal bias. Someone who's never experienced a platformer before might have a bad time if they don't take to the mechanics quickly or pick a tougher game. Maybe someone went into a game with certain expectations of it, and those expectations fell short. When it comes to looking at a long-running franchise or older titles, nostalgia can play a huge part in someone's quote objective review. All that just to say that this look of Ocarina of Time is going to be filled to the brim with personal bias. This is the Opinionative show, not the Objective Truth show. For some reason, Ocarina of Time is a very touchy subject and can send emotions into all sorts of directions. This video is made with as much love and admiration for the game as one can muster, but I'm going to talk about everything, which includes things that I like and things I don't. I've been playing this game since the early 2000s, and for the first time ever, I completed this game 100% to make sure I have all my ducks in a row. You have undoubtedly noticed by now that this footage is not from the original Nintendo 64 game, nor the GameCube port, nor the 3DS remake. Originally, my plan was to do the 3DS remake as I find it to be a better overall experience, if nothing for the text speed. Unfortunately, I do not own a 3DS with a capture card mod, and at the time of writing have no idea how to go about getting one. I do have this bootleg way of recording for my 3DS, but it requires me to connect it to my PC with an audio jack, and that'd be fine, but the slightest movement caused it to make awful scratchy noises that were absolutely not going to cut it. I still hope to look at it at some point, but without proper hardware to record it, I'm at a loss for now. If you're wondering, I thought about emulation, but the game has some use of the touchscreen, and that's just awkward to play with using the mouse. Instead, what I'll be using is the massive fan project Ship of Harkinian. What's essentially Ocarina of Time ported to PC, the options and customizability are insane with this one. I mentioned text speed in the 3DS remake. You can adjust that here too. Widescreen support, variable frame rate, smoothed edges, texture pack capabilities, custom colors, and even music on top of a myriad of other options to play with and adjust to your liking. There's even a toggle option to make it look and feel like the original as well, with a smaller resolution, simulated CRT fuzz, and 20 FPS. It won't satisfy the purists out there, but after my eyes got adjusted to the new frame rate, I had no issues with it. You do have to supply your own ROM if you want to play it, but that's probably what's keeping it alive, so I was more than happy to do my own legwork. If you don't like that, then feel free to leave your angry comment about how this delegitimizes the whole video and click off. With all that being said, welcome ladies and gentlemen to the Opinionative show, an internet thing where I have opinions and you're going to listen to them. These are my opinions on one of Nintendo's most revered titles, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. As a quick heads up before we begin proper, this will be your one and only spoiler warning. I know there are people out there who haven't played this game, and I am going to be talking about it from front to back, attempting to leave no stone unturned. If you somehow manage to avoid having this game spoiled, kudos to you, and I strongly encourage you to play it for yourself. After all, this video will still be here long after you're done. A great Zelda game needs a good title screen. All 4 previous games had similar title screens where they showcase the title with an image while their iconic theme plays. But these games are all 2D, so Nintendo decided to go all out with their first entry in 3D. It starts off very similar, having the title in nearly still image while the theme plays, but this time you've got Link riding in on a horse. Already showcasing the new 3D graphics, we start to get a glimpse at the scope Nintendo was going for when it starts to pan over all of Hyrule Field, following Link as he rides around on his horse. Everything about this is very relaxing. The choice to have this take place at night is an odd one as well. I don't get big adventure vibes from it like the previous titles, but it is showcasing two brand new mechanics without even pushing a single button: a day-to-night cycle and horse riding. Between those and the size of Hyrule Field, we get to see quite a bit of difference between this game and its previous entries. Hanging around on the title screen long enough shows a couple of the game's cutscenes, but they're weirdly spoilerish even without the context. But that's enough of the title screen. Let's get this game started. Right away, we see the last bit of brilliance from the title screen. Throughout the whole scene, Link is clearly an adult. This is most definitely a child. This is once again a show of scope. Instead of an alternate dimension, in this game we get to deal with time. Unless there's a specific reason for it, both young and adult Link will just be referred to as Link. Link is in bed having a nightmare. This nightmare consists of him standing outside of a castle drawbridge as two people flee atop a white horse. Following right after them is an oppressing figure, his horse black as night. Without any words, this man is clearly evil. Cut to a conversation between a tree and a fairy, the great Deku tree and Navi respectfully. The Deku tree informs Navi of a terrible evil that is about to come across the land and that the time is now, as he is ready. Navi takes flight, and the mood turns a complete 180 as we go from a serious conversation to a whimsical journey around the village. One bump on the head later, and the duo is united. Navi is essentially our guide, and will be with Link for the entire journey. She's used to not only give advice on where to go, but also gives a little bit of information about NPCs and enemies. Think the telephone trees from Link's Awakening, or the fortune tellers in Link to the Past, but mobile. She's also the in-game explanation for Z-targeting, and I love this. Locking on enemies in action games is a very common mechanic nowadays and is a seamless gameplay element that we don't need an in-game explanation for because it's simply just something you do. Back in 1998, this wasn't the case. While I'm sure the audience wouldn't have cared if it was simply just a mechanic, the fact that Nintendo did this to make it even easier to understand is brilliant. Of course, Z-targeting, referred to as such because you use the Z button, isn't the only new thing to get used to in this game. Legend of Zelda is all 3D now, and with it comes a new set of challenges. Thanks to the joystick, there is now a full 360 degree of motion, giving that much extra precision to Link's movement. There's a dedicated shield button, and this makes much more sense in a 3D environment over Link's Awakening. Pushing the button while targeting something will raise your shield at the target, while pushing it without makes Link crouch and raise his shield in a general direction. There's also a dedicated button reserved for your sword, as it should be, along with 3 buttons used for items. That's right, we've upgraded from 1 item to 3 items. One huge quality of life upgrade that SOH has is you can assign items to the D-pad buttons, bringing your total equipable items to a whopping 7 items. That's not where the quality changes end, but I'll get to them in a bit. Finally, we have the context-sensitive buttons. Depending on what's going on, this can do things from talking to NPCs, rolling, side hops, and backflips. Jumping is automatically performed by fully tilting the stick off of a ledge. That last bit is important. We won't be seeing a dedicated jump button all the way until Breath of the Wild. The game is built around not having one, and frankly I don't know how they do it given the button layout of the N64 controller, but I really wish there was one. I always did, and it's something I'd want going forward with all the future entries as well. I've never had an issue making jumps, but there are a couple of spots throughout the series where I wish I could just drop off a ledge instead of either jumping or awkwardly hanging down and dropping. Minor nitpick, but expect many of them. As expected, the first area of the game is a safe haven that allows you to play around with the controls and get used to the new 3D environment and all the changes that come with it. Kokiri Forest is a safe haven where the Kokiri reside under the protection of the Great Deku Tree. The Kokiri themselves are basically a race of Neverland kids who don't age and I believe are immortal, but I don't have enough knowledge to confirm or deny this. What I do know, though, is that they all have a guardian fairy, and if they ever leave the forest, they will die. That I don't believe is ever explained in the game, but it is in the game's manual. Real quick, I want to talk about the game manual, since they've been dead for years now, and that will never not be said. It's largely your standard affair. It's got instructions, explains the various menu screens in the game, a surprisingly robust list of the various things the action button does, and a bit of story. Unlike other Zelda games so far, the story section here doesn't actually actually add anything you won't get in the game. Weirdly enough, the story is basically just the first 20 minutes of the game summarized. There's also a section about the horse where it explains that in order to get it, you need to do something special, but the horse Link's riding in the picture is not Epona, the staple horse of the franchise. You can ride these horses pictured, but it's a waste of time. I'll explain a little bit later. Back to the Kokiri Forest. After you're done playing around and learning the controls, it's time to head off to see what the big tree wants to talk about. Unfortunately for Link, a bratty kid stands in the way named Mido. Mido doesn't like Link. It's in part because Link never had a fairy, which is pretty suspicious for a Kokiri, but it's mostly due to the fact that Mido likes Saria, who is Link's lifelong friend and has a thing for him. I'd say there's some kind of love triangle going on, but it's more like a line since Link's head is about as empty as Big the Cat's, and I believe he's largely incapable of such emotion. I won't harp on it too much in this video since it is the N64, but just know in general, I think silent protagonists are almost always awful, especially in a story-driven game. Mido won't let us pass to see the Great Deku Tree because monsters have been showing up and it's dangerous to go empty-handed. In order to get past, we need a sword and a shield. The shield can be bought in the shop for 40 rupees, which you'll find scattered throughout the area, and the sword is tucked away through this little hole. I do appreciate that the Kokiri have something to defend themselves with should invaders show up, as unlikely as that would be, but I think having a frictionless, ever-rolling boulder guard it is a bit overkill. Regardless, with our newly found equipment in hand, it's time to tell Mido to take a hike and finally see what the Great Deku Tree wants. He talks about Ganondorf a little bit, then explains that a terrible curse has been placed on him and needs your help to lift it. In order to do so, you must travel within and defeat the monsters that have taken up residence. We agree, and then head inside, entering the first ever 3D Zelda dungeon. Time to see how these dungeons stack up compared to the previous games. Naturally, it's not fair to directly compare them like it did with Link's Awakening, considering there's more than just advanced hardware at play. We've got an entire extra dimension now. They put it to use right away too. This dungeon is incredibly vertical. The challenge is to get through the webbing in the center of the floor here. You can't cut it, but it's pretty elastic. Jumping from a height makes it bounce up and down a lot. This leads you to go upward, but the only climbable surface is covered in these Skulltula spiders. You can't reach them with your sword, so you're going to need something else with a range. This takes you into this room where you get the first item that isn't either the Deku stick or a nut, the slingshot. It works exactly like the bow does, except now you can aim it all around instead of just firing straight ahead. To let you test it, they had this puzzle where you'd shoot down a ladder since this floating block you can jump on crumbles away after you step on it. But if you just don't jump to it when you enter, you can use it to leave instead. There are a surprising number of ways certain puzzles can be tackled, albeit some use glitches to get around, and I like that there's not always one singular way to tackle a problem. Just as an FYI, when I mention glitches, they all pretty much require specific setup to perform. These aren't the types of glitches you'll just run into during normal gameplay. For being the first 3D Zelda game, the number of bugs and glitches you can encounter throughout normal gameplay is actually staggeringly small. I can only think of one, and it's this ledge leading up to Death Mountain that I'm not sure is built properly, as sometimes the automated jump just doesn't happen. With the slingshot in hand, the Skulltulas are handedly defeated, allowing us to get to the top floor. There is another room up here with this game's big collectible, the Golden Skulltula. Defeating it drops a Golden Skulltula token, 1 of 100. That's right. There are 100 of these things scattered across the world in its dungeons. I'll get into how I feel about these critters in a bit. Let's get through the rest of this dungeon. From the top floor, jumping down into the center of the web causes it to break underneath Link's feet and takes him down to the bottom floor. The rest of the puzzles are designed to get you used to newer mechanics. Pressing this switch lights the torch, showing that webs can be removed with fire as well. Using a Deku stick, you can carry that fire around and burn the other webs to get through. In the next room, you practice more with the slingshot's free aim to hit the switches that opens the door. After that, it's time to practice with swimming and diving. You need to hit the switch which lowers the water and lets you go under the spinning spike bar. Afterwards, you push or pull this block to get up to the next door. In here, it's just more web burning and a bit of combat. There's a hole that takes you back to where you started in another room that can't be entered just yet. Going through the hole back at the beginning of the floor, we're now on this elevated area where we can push this block off the ledge, grab the flame, and burn our way through where we encounter the final puzzle. It can be brute forced, but one of the previously defeated Deku shrubs just gives away the answer. The famous 23 is number 1. Beat them in that order, and we're finally on to the boss. The boss is none other than the famed Gohma, though she's gone through quite a redesign. For one, her eye is noticeably smaller than in previous games, and she has this extra appendage in the back. She's still fought the same way though, hit the eye. This time though, hitting the eye just stuns her, you'll still need to swing your sword to do any damage. After damage is dealt, Gohma will retreat up the wall and onto the ceiling. If you fail to shoot her eye in time after it goes red, she'll start dropping down eggs which will hatch into the little Gohmas encountered earlier. This is the easiest Gohma has ever been though, so she goes down in no time at all and we are granted the first heart container and warp out of there. I'll try to avoid going into a full walkthrough with every dungeon in this game, but I just love how this dungeon is designed. It's a classic case of a tutorial that's disguised well enough that it doesn't actually feel like a tutorial. Sure, you are interrupted a few times by Navi to give you actual tutorial prompts, but disconnect her from the dungeon and you have one crazy opener. The environment is just fun as well. You're inside a giant tree. The atmosphere is calming and the music adds great ambience that completes the area. One massive point of contention I have is actually with another part of the music. Battle music. I don't like it. I find this game's battle music uninteresting, short, and it interrupts whatever track is already playing. Thankfully, SOH is here to once again improve the game. If you so desire, there is a toggle that will actually disable the battle music entirely. You still have the themes for mini and regular bosses, but the normal battle theme will no longer interrupt your listening pleasures. Unfortunately, this issue is constant with the rest of the series, but thankfully the themes get better. After defeating Gohma, the Deku tree gives you a rundown on the situation. It's here we learn a bit about the land of Hyrule and how it was created by the three goddesses Nehru, Furore, and Din. He goes on to explain a bit about the evil that is Ganondorf and that you are in fact not a Kokiri, but a Hylian who also happens to be the chosen one who must stop him. You are directed to seek out Princess Zelda, handed the Kokiri Emerald, the importance of which comes into play later, and then the Great Deku Tree dies. On your way out of the forest, Mito stops you again, blaming you for the tree's death, and Saria catches you on your way out. She hands you her ocarina, hoping it'll help you remember the Kokiri as you adventure forth. Link leaves, and we are finally out of the forest and in Hyrule. So going forward, I'm going to talk about the game's elements in chunks. It's mostly to try and keep my thoughts a bit organized, if that's even possible, but it should also make it a bit easier to skip around if you want to hear me talk about something specific. My plan is to talk about the entire game, but I'm not trying to walk you through it. Everything will end up with at least one side tangent, I'm sure. But that's just how my brain works, so please bear with me. I'll do my best to keep it relevant so we're not jumping all around. Let's start off with the elephant in the room that is Hyrule Field. It's massive. And it's bland. Hyrule Field is essentially a wide open, bare bones hub as it is dead center of the world map and everything leads out into it. Starting from the top, you can find Castle Town and Hyrule Castle. In the upper right is Kakariko Village, which leads to Death Mountain and the Goron City, with Zora's River south leading to Zora's Domain and the Kokiri Forest in the southeast corner. To the west of that, you have Lake Hylia, and north of that is the land of the Gerudo, which contain their fortress in a vast desert. Finally, you have Lon Lon Ranch smack dab in the center of the field. Navigating the world is very easy. You have a map screen that is accurate, albeit a bit low res. Getting to any of these destinations is not hard, just tedious. As I said before, Hyrule is a vast land and they made it a bit too big for its own good. The individual areas outside of Hyrule Field are pretty compact and filled with things to do, whether it's obstacles to overcome, NPCs to converse with, or secret holes to find. Hyrule Field does have a few secrets and enemies, but the field itself takes what feels like ages to cross. Take the first crossing after you leave the forest as an example. Ignoring the owl, who punishes you for spamming through his text by having the default option loop the dialogue again. SOH has a toggle that can change this, by the way. By the time you get all the way to your next destination, Castle Town, it will be night. When it becomes night, the drawbridge comes up and enemies start to spawn. This isn't really much of an issue to deal with, but it takes what feels like ages for day to come, and fighting the Stalfos that spawn is pointless since you'll only get rupees from them and nothing more. Before I found out that standing on roads prevents them from spawning, a brilliant callback to Zelda 2, I would just stand on this little partition and wait until morning. At least once you get the sun song, you'll be able to change it from day to night on a whim, but it still doesn't defeat the issue of size. That's not to say big equals bad, you just need something to do in it that's either fun visually, mechanically, or thematically, and Ocarina of Time has none of those things here in Hyrule Field. Everywhere else, however, is thankfully not the case. Let's start from the top and work our way clockwise, shall we? At the very top, we have Castletown and Hyrule Castle itself. The town is a perfect example of scaling done right. If you take it at face value, the town would hardly be considered a village. You have a grand total of 3 stores, an open market area, 3 entertainment centers with one only open at night, and a singular alley which is really more of a by road since it's where everyone's houses are. Beyond that, you've got the Temple of Time and Hyrule Castle. Despite the lack of architecture and literal size, they still make Castletown feel enormous by having everything in real cramped with NPCs everywhere. Combine that with the crowd noise and you've got a perfectly scaled down version of a city that would likely hold tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Hylians. The minigames it has to offer aren't anything complicated, but they serve as fun distractions. The slingshot minigame has you hit targets in a fixed pattern, so as long as you either have quick reaction time or memorize the pattern, you can win no problem. It's actually a bit worth it as well, considering you get an upgrade to your slingshot capacity. I used to dread the treasure chest minigame though. You pay for a key and you use it to unlock one of 2 chests. If you get another key, you proceed. If you get a rupee, you fail and you have to try again. The chests are completely random every time, so there's nothing you can do skill-wise to make it easier for yourself. What I didn't know for the longest time is that you can use the Lens of Truth, an item you'd normally get much later into the game to see through chests. I'm glad that the game isn't completely up to chance if you have it, but it's an inconsistent use of said item because no other chest in the game works like this. Your reward is only a piece of heart, so unless you're going for 100%, then I'd argue you can just pass this one up. The real fun comes in Bombchu bowling. You've got 10 Bombchus and you need to make it into 3 progressively difficult holes. What are Bombchus? New to the Zelda franchise, Bombchus are bombs that are designed like a bomb-sized mouse that goes forward. You can't throw them, but they will crawl along any surface until they either hit a target or their fuse goes off. That's the gist of what you need to know to play the minigame. The challenge of this minigame comes from angling Link properly so the Bombchus will avoid the obstacles and hit the target. I really like doing this, and there's a very satisfying feel when you manage to go 3 for 3. One of the rewards is also very worth it, even if it's the most expensive minigame. Just beyond that, we have Hyrule Castle. This place isn't really used for much, more of just a story beat with an incredibly bare bones and out-of-place stealth section. I'd be lying if I said I didn't like it though. Getting up to the castle isn't strenuous at all, and the music that plays inside the courtyard perfectly encapsulates the situation of a 10-year-old evading 16 different guards and getting right next to the princess who, in this game, is the only lineage to the royal throne. There are a lot of fun visual elements to look at here. I love all the waterworks, and of course there's this picture of Mario characters. You've also got my favorite Easter egg in the whole game. If you shoot the window, a guard basically tells you to scram, and then throws a live bomb at you. If only they disciplined their soldiers like that, they probably wouldn't have such glaring security issues. Oh. And if you try to enter the castle at night, there are 2 guards that are just posted up by the drainage hole you enter from, making the night shift definitively better than day shift. Moving along, next we have Kakariko Village. Unlike Link to the Past, we're not a wanted criminal this time and are free to explore to our heart's content. It's quite a bit more peaceful than Castletown, with all the buildings and people spread out, more grass as opposed to cobblestone. There's no overlaying crowd noises, and the music is much more somber than Castletown's was. Life is good here, except there's a bunch of chickens running around. Return all of them and you're rewarded with a bottle, which is a huge reward for such a small task. It's not all sunshine and rainbows. Kakariko holds a very dark secret. The worst child dungeon in the whole game. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So instead I'm going to talk about this game's big collectible, golden Skulltula tokens. I mentioned it previously talking about the start of the game, but these tokens are your reward for finding and defeating golden Skulltulas that are hidden across all of Hyrule. In Kakariko Village, you can enter this building here, the Skulltula house, and you'll run into 6 people who have been cursed to become these terrifying half-human, half-Skulltula people. They aren't aggressive, and it seems as though their humanity is still intact. They've been cursed because of greed, and the only way to break the curse is to kill the golden Skulltulas and retrieve their tokens. Of course, you'll be rewarded as you go along the way. For every 10 tokens up to 50, you will receive a prize, along with a big bonus for getting all 100. In a normal playthrough of Ocarina of Time, I would not recommend bothering with this. At most, I'd say get 20, since you'll very likely come across that many just in dungeons and along your travels without having to go out of your way, netting you an upgraded wallet. Even this isn't super necessary, since other than minigames, rupees are back to being basically useless, and you'll be stacked. Nothing in the shops is ever required, anything can be found in the wild, and to make matters worse, everything is stupidly expensive as well, especially bottled items. Seriously, I've never once bought a bottled item. Back to the tokens, finding them isn't too difficult. They produce a unique sound when you're near them, giving it away that they're around. They don't attack, but they do pack a wallop if you accidentally touch them. Most of them will require you to use an item to retrieve the token once they're defeated, and if you don't have one of those items yet, then that means you'll have to remember where you left the bug and come back later. This, and some golden Skulltulas only appear at night, are my 2 chief complaints for this hunt. That's right, some tokens are only achievable during the wee hours of the night. If you're going to go for all 100, make sure you get the Sun Song, since there's nothing worse than just waiting around for the time of day to change just so you can get a couple tokens. Netting all 100 of them just gives you an infinite source of rupees, which by the time you get all 100, there's no way you'll need them. For how much time this adds to the adventure, I would have liked to get something a bit more substantial. I'm sure if Ocarina of Time were to have come out in the modern day, you'd probably get an achievement, so if that makes you feel better, then go for it. Otherwise, if you're going to bother collecting them at all, just get 20. But if you go for all 50, at least you get a piece of heart, which is a much better reward than all 100. Real quick, before going to the next area, Kakariko does have a couple minigames in it. The construction zone here becomes an archery range when you become an adult, and it functions just like the child version, except the order the rupees appear in is random instead of a fixed pattern. The rupees still keep their patterns, but there's no order that you can memorize. The other minigame is Dampé's Grave Digging Tour, and oh joy, is it bad. If you recall the digging minigame from Link to the Past and how I didn't like it, Dampé's is just like that, only much, much worse. For starters, cost to perform is the same, but unlike the digging game, you only get 1 dig. At night, but not too late since Dampé goes to sleep eventually. That's right, if you enter Kakariko too late at night, you'll have to wait all the way until the next night. Playing the Sun Song inside the town or graveyard won't fix this, as if you play inside a location where time doesn't move, it skips 12 hours, as opposed to right at time change like being outside would. So you have to leave out to either Death Mountain or Hyrule Field. Dampé will be found wandering around the graveyard. If you hand him 10 rupees, he'll do 1 dig, and whatever comes up, you get to keep. This can be nothing, to a couple of rupees, to the grand prize of a single piece of heart. This wouldn't be so bad if the dig wasn't completely random. Dampé needs to be over a dirt patch, and he moves so slow. You can get it in your first shot. You might need to pay him hundreds of rupees before you get it. Sure, rupees are super easy to get, but this minigame still blows. Enough of that. Let's move on to Death Mountain in the Goron City. Home to what I believe to be the first instance of the Goron, Death Mountain is back, and it has never been less threatening. It does contain 2 dungeons, but the hazards here are weak, and the mountain itself isn't nearly as interesting as its 2D counterparts. While nothing will probably be worse than Zelda 2's version, it's honestly a bit disappointing. The most hazardous stretch is this bit leading up to Death Mountain Crater, and newcomers will likely run through it the intended way by crouching with a Hylian shield to stop the falling rocks, but funny enough, you can outpace them if you simply backwards walk through it. If you're playing the SOH port and using the faster bunny hood feature, this won't work since the boulders actually home in on your front side and you'll still run into them. In case you're wondering, I absolutely use this feature, but only for the speed increase. You can make it 100% like Majora's Mask, where it also affects your jump distance, but I figured this was unnecessary, and if I was going to break a puzzle in half, it would be by my own hand as opposed to what is essentially a cheat code. Tucked inside the mountain is Goron City, home to the fine Goron people, these sentient beings that are seemingly made of some amalgamation of flesh and rock. The city itself is multi-layered and has quite a bit to do in it. Not only does it have 3 different places you can exit to, that being Death Mountain Crater, the Lost Woods, and Death Mountain back towards Kakariko Village, but it has a few different activities to do and quite a few secrets and goodies laying around. The giant jar is another RNG fest where you need to throw a bomb inside and hope it lands on the happy face for your reward. It's not quite as bad as Dompe though, since it doesn't have a monetary cost to it, and if you land on the neutral face, then it'll spit out more bombs for you to throw inside. And it actually requires some skill on your part to get the bomb inside in the first place. You'll come back here numerous times for story reasons, so it'll be a place you'll become very acquainted with. Just don't give this Goron any of your money. I'm not sure what he did to be sealed away by so many walls, but he tries to sell you a Goron knife, and it will break after about 10 swings or so, and become basically useless. A precursor to Breath of the Wild by nearly 20 years. Since it feeds directly into it, let's talk about the Lost Woods. The Lost Woods and how it evolves throughout the series is easily one of my favorite parts of any Zelda game. They're not all great. Zelda ones tend to come to mind, but I still like the idea of it. This one is pretty simple. All you need to do is follow the music. There will be many different paths you can take, but most of them are just fake and act as exits that will spit you back out into the Kokiri Forest. However, if you listen to the music, it'll actually begin to fade out as you start to head into a wrong exit. Simply find where the tunes are and you'll get through the forest with ease. There are a couple offshoots that house a couple Deku Scrub merchants, but they aren't super useful. With the exception of 2, these guys are found all over the world. If you get them out of their hole, they will sell you an item. Usually it's some sort of consumable such as a potion or ammo, and it's great if you really need whatever they have, but only 4 out of all 41 have anything of value. I think it would have been better if there were fewer of these scrubs, but they were all more substantial in what they sold you. I think it'd even be kind of funny if a couple of them sold golden Skulltula tokens. There are also a couple activities to do in here as well. You've got this super easy target game where you just have to hit it dead center 3 times in a row and you're rewarded with an upgraded ammo capacity for your slingshot. It takes all of 2 seconds to do it, and you will be required to pass by it at least once, so there's no reason to not just pick it up really quick. The same can't be said for the memory game though. If you hop on this stump down below the target game and pull out your ocarina, some skull kids will ask to play a game with you. They play a random series of notes and you have to memorize them. There are 2 levels to this. The first one isn't too bad because it's just up to 5 notes, but the second one doubles the notes required. It still isn't too hard to memorize them, but that's because the actual tempo is agonizingly slow, and if you want that piece of heart, you need to do both levels. I know I'm not using the proper hardware for this since I'm playing with a PlayStation controller and using a stick instead of the C buttons, but accidentally hitting the wrong note because you're just checked out is soul crushing. The Lost Woods doesn't only lead from the Goron City to the Kokiri Forest. Aside from the couple alcoves I mentioned, it also leads to the Forest Temple and has an exit to the back end of Zora's River right next to the entrance to their domain. If you have at least the Silver Scale, an item that lets Link dive deeper in water, you can use it to get through this entrance to the river. I never looked forward to crossing Zora's River. It's not difficult, but it's just a bit annoying. The river itself has a heavy flow, and if you fall into it at certain parts, it can be difficult to get out. There's a frog minigame here if you're a child, and on any regular playthrough, I can never be bothered. Your final reward is a piece of heart, but you must collect and play every non-teleporting song for these singing frogs, with one exception being the Song of Storms, which you won't be able to get until after becoming an adult. The actual game, after playing all the songs where you have to play the notes based on where the butterfly is above the frogs, also doesn't seem to work half the time either. Unlike the memory game in Lost Woods, the notes you have to play for the frogs aren't random, so you can easily memorize the pattern, or look them up. But there have been a bunch of times where I swear I hit the correct button and it just fails regardless. I don't know if it's an issue with controller sensitivity, but it's just annoying to get through. Thankfully, When I did it this time, it worked without issue, so who knows what's going on. At the top of the river, there's a waterfall that acts as a barrier to Zora's domain. Playing Zelda's Lullaby, acquired after meeting with her in Hyrule Castle, parts the waterfall and lets you inside. It doesn't stay open, however, and I do wish that it would, but I understand from a worldview why, as that's essentially the same as leaving your front door open so it's more convenient when you return home after work. Also, it's not exactly quick, but if you find yourself needing some money, just swim down the river. When you get to the fork, make sure you take the long way, as you'll end up with more invisible rupees, including a red rupee for going under the center of the bridge. This only works if you're a child, and there's a much simpler method to make money just inside the domain. If you go beyond that waterfall at the top, you enter Zora's domain. This place is super relaxing and well worth the trip up the river to get here. Right away, you've got the wonderful rocky cave sides that have this light reflected from the water on them. Combine that with the sounds of the flowing waterfall and the mesmerizing theme that uses steel drums, and you've got one of my favorite locations in the entire game. Let's take a moment here and now to just appreciate everything that's going on in here. It's in this area where you can play the diving minigame, where the Zora will throw a bunch of rupees and you need to collect them all. On your first completion, you're rewarded with a scale that allows you to dive deeper underwater. It's not actually used for too many things, but it will allow you to use this lower exit in the domain for quick access to and from Lake Hylia. Playing the minigame again after this has him throw out more and often better rupees, so as long as you can pay the 20 rupees fee to enter, this is a decent way to make some money if you ever get desperate. Up at the top is the King Zora. He's just like a normal Zora, but much taller and a bit more rotund. Behind him is the exit to Zora's fountain, and despite it being outside, time does not flow here. Okay, I have absolutely no idea where to fit this rant in, so I'm just going to stick it here. So going forward, if I bring up the issue, I can simply bring it up and move on. Ocarina of Time is the first game to have a day-to-night cycle mechanic in it. It's definitely not the first game to do this, as there are games that have this cycle dating back to the 80s, such as Castlevania 2 or Dragon Quest 3, just name a couple. I've already mentioned a couple changes that happen at night, with the castle's drawbridge going up, or Dampé's stupid digging game, but my biggest issue is the rules for when time changes are not consistent. Sounds silly, but hear me out. Without using the Sun Song, time flows when you are not in a town or a building, but not always. Likely, the first area you'll enter that breaks this rule is the Lost Woods, but to a certain degree, I can understand that given these are mystic woods where anyone who enters that isn't a Kokiri is destined to end up lost and will die, turning into a Stalfos. These woods are magical. It's highly probable that to an onlooker, if one were to enter, they'd either never exit or exit immediately, but still having experienced everything that happened while they were in the forest. Zora's fountain doesn't have any sort of mythical lore tied to it that would make sense for this inconsistency with the cycle. It's just a giant pond that houses a giant fish that gets frozen over later in the game. There are also 2 golden Skulltulas to get here as a child, and a third as an adult. If you don't have the Sun Song and get here but meant for it to be night, then that means you will have to leave the fountain to the domain, then from the domain to the outside world, and wait. When you leave Castle Town to go to the actual castle, time begins flowing again. When you leave Kakariko to go to Death Mountain, time begins flowing again. Why doesn't it here when it'd be kind of nice if it did? Skipping ahead a bit when you're an adult, you'll eventually end up crossing from the Gerudo Valley to the fortress to the desert. The valley is outside, time flows as you'd expect. Entering the fortress, time is now stopped. This makes some sense, seeing as this could be argued as a town, but then if you go to the desert, time is still frozen. You can make the same argument I made with the Lost Woods, and I'd be okay with that, except that it's actually much easier to cross during the day simply because it's brighter. Crossing through takes us to the desert Colossus, where time resumes flowing again, thankfully, but this area is more or less the same as the fountain, so why does it flow here but not there? I know having a constantly flowing day-night cycle makes the world feel a little bit more realistic, but to be completely honest, I just don't like how it's implemented here. At least not when I'm going for 100%. On a typical playthrough of mine, it has had very little bearing on how I play, but trying to collect every single Skulltula token and having to constantly switch it from day to night just drags, and I have played a ton of Wind Waker, so I am well accustomed to having to spam a song repeatedly through an adventure. Alright, let's return to talking about what I actually enjoy. Zora's fountain is a giant pond that contains a giant fish. This fish, of course, being the great Jabu-Jabu. Feed him a smaller fish and he will swallow you whole. I'll get more into it when I talk about dungeons. But yeah, this sure is a dungeon. Other than that, there's a secret fairy that is hidden rather cleverly at a glance. The wall you blow up doesn't look any different than anything else going on in here, but you're drawn to here with a rock that can be blown up, and it's placed close enough so that you'll end up revealing the opening. It also leaves this gray rock completely undestroyed. A bit of a foreshadowing that you're not done with this area quite yet. Coming back as an adult, this area changes quite a bit compared to other places. Jabu-Jabu is gone, and while I can't find it, I remember seeing a theory online that these ice platforms are just frozen chunks of the now dead fish. Considering Ganon kills the Deku tree, there is some merit to this, but personally I think that Nintendo just didn't give it much thought, and the fish is just on vacation somewhere. Next area is Lake Hylia. It suffers from the same issue Hyrule Field does, but it's about the size that Hyrule Field really should be. It's a wide open lake, but there are a few things to do here. For starters, it's where you begin the side quest to get the secret Scarecrow song. The song doesn't appear in your list, but it is a very handy song that I recommend anyone take the time to get it. It's used to summon scarecrows in certain parts of Hyrule that act as shortcuts to either help around certain obstacles or even reach secret areas. There's also a temple that everyone on the internet loves and no one hates it at all. But, and you guessed it, we'll talk about that later. Oh yes, we will. Lake Hylia is also home to my favorite minigame, fishing. I love fishing side activities. Sure, they're not always great, and I can understand why someone wouldn't like them if it was, say, mandatory to beat the game, but this time it's completely optional. It's also not complicated. You just need to get a fish that sets a record. To fish, you simply cast the line out and jiggle it around until a fish sees it. I've seen top level players struggle with this, and I'm not entirely sure if it's for show or not, but in order to get the fish to bite, all you have to do is simply hold down the analog stick and reel back until the fish locks onto it. Once it does, simply wait until you have a bite and then reel it back in. If you're standing too deep in the water, it seems to always break free, so make sure you're standing kind of close to the edge. I really wish that it didn't play the battle music when the fish bites though. I'd really prefer it if it didn't change anything at all. Though if it absolutely had to change the music, it should change it to the horse-related theme. One last note before moving on, I never understood the architecture before the lake in Hyrule Field. It's two super high fences that you need to horse jump over in a strangely placed wall that has a ladder so you're not completely locked out. When playing, I just kind of ignore it, but I wonder why it's there. I imagine Lake Hylia would be a tourist destination, but this seems like it's trying to keep everyone out. Or maybe it's trying to keep something in? Not a clue. Just wanted to mention it. Bear with me now, there are only 2 more areas to talk about. For the Gerudo Desert, I'm going to be considering all the areas as one. Starting from the front, you've got this giant gorge with a video game classic, a secret behind the waterfall. Unfortunately, getting it means you'll need to swim down the river, which spits you out into Lake Hylia. In fact, there are so many secrets down the gorge, and getting them all in one go can be pretty tricky. And just as you'd expect, every time you go for one, it's a long swim followed by the long climb back. As a child, the bridge is blocked off by the Gerudo, preventing you from going any further. Coming back as an adult, the bridge is no longer being guarded, but is now destroyed. Getting across the bridge is simple. You need either the long shot or the horse, and you can just jump across. For the longest time, I didn't know that you could use the long shot, and I thought that Epona was mandatory for this. On the other side, there's a tent with a man standing outside of it who's upset because all of his carpenters have been imprisoned inside the Gerudo Fortress. Rescuing them isn't too difficult. You just need to navigate their fortress and avoid the gaze of any wandering warrior. Doing so at night decreases their sight range, making it significantly easier than during the day. It's not too difficult to get through, but there are a couple of side paths you can take that will waste your time and increase your chances of getting caught. When you come across a cell with a carpenter in it, they beckon you over and give you some sob story about how they just wanted to join the Gerudo, but since they are an all-female race, the answer was a big fat no. Link is then ambushed by one, and you fight until she drops a key to the cell and runs away. The fight itself isn't super hard, but there are a couple moves that can have you arrested instead of just taking damage. Getting arrested throws you in this cage up above that you need to hookshot your way out, and you can just try again. Freeing all the carpenters and besting the leader in combat has her earn Link's respect and grants the Gerudo card, which is essentially a note saying one of us. This not only lets you wander around the Gerudo's land freely, but grants access to the desert and the Colossus beyond that. I really like the look of the fortress itself. The whole area is in stark contrast to everything else in the game, with everything being brown and tan as opposed to the lush greenery beyond the gorge. The rest of the area is largely just desert. Beyond the fortress is a section where you need to cross a sand river, and the whole area is cursed with this permanent dust storm. It's similar to the Lost Woods in that you need to navigate a certain path, but instead of having very distinct holes to go through with music cues, you instead have to follow a path, and straying away from that path will send you back to the entrance of the desert along with taking some damage. Luckily, there's a friendly ghost who will lead the way should you possess the means to see it. He's a bit of a troll though, as you'll end up passing by the exit the first time you walk through. Exiting the storm leads to the Desert Colossus. It's home to the Spirit Temple and very much feels like some sort of Egyptian desert. Jumping the gun a bit, but there aren't any Gibdos here, which is a missed opportunity. But we're not to the dungeons yet, and the area itself has quite a few extras to find. Just make sure you keep moving, as you'll sink slightly into the sand, causing slower movement. On top of that, levers constantly spawn and harass you as you try to get around. You've got a few rocks and even a cave you can bomb open to reveal another great fairy fountain. Other than the constant barrage of enemies, this is another fun area to be. I love the way it looks, and time actually flows, so getting the Skulltulas here isn't too bad. It's also the only place where you need to use the bean patch to actually get a secret without major glitches. Finally, we move on to the last overworld area in the game, Lon Lon Ranch. I don't like it. If you guess the reason being it's just too big, then you're correct. Arguably, it isn't necessary to come here at all since the main reward you'll get is Epona, but that's something I would always recommend doing, especially if you're not using SOH, and it will be mandatory if you plan to 100% this game. Getting the horse itself isn't too hard. As a child, you come here and learn Epona's song, which is then used as an adult to get the horse to come to you. 2 races later, horse is yours. It makes sense for the range to be a big, wide open space. It is where animals are supposed to roam after all, but it doesn't really fill that space with anything meaningful or interesting. Not only that, but all the collectibles are tucked away in the furthest corners here, making it so you will have to traverse nearly the entire perimeter of it. It's not so bad if you're just going for Epona, but overall it just suffers from a size versus content issue. There's also a minigame to play as a child where you need to grab these super chickens within 30 seconds. There's nothing to distinguish them from the rest, so my advice would be to track at least 2 of them as they get tossed in, then just start grabbing all of them where the 3rd one was thrown. Just be careful of any next to the door. If you accidentally leave, you'll have wasted your money as you need to start again. Winning gives you a bottle with Lon Lon milk in it, so the reward is definitely worth a small amount of effort to get it. The music is just super relaxing. You could slap it over any farming scenario and it would fit perfectly. Alright, that was a lot, but it needs to be said that the game, for all its beauty, suffers from bloat. I don't know if it was an attempt to just show off what 3D games are capable of, or if there was simply just more planned that didn't quite make the cut. I am aware of the known cut content, but even that doesn't seem like it would have fixed the spatial issues these areas have, particularly with Hyrule Field, which you will visit and traverse over and over and over again. You will get warp songs that take you to each of the 5 temples as well as the Temple of Time, so it helps with travel a bit, but it doesn't change the pure size of it all. The previous games had this nailed. I don't recall having an issue with traversing taking too long. At least when you're outside of Hyrule Field, there are plenty of sights to see and things to do, though I will admit these textures haven't aged the most gracefully. I wouldn't exactly hold it against the game since it's early on in the console's life cycle. Graphics can put off people, and to a certain degree I get that, but the gameplay more than makes up for any graphical shortcoming. But now, it's finally time to get what makes a Zelda game for me. Dungeons. They're quintessential to making a Zelda game a Zelda game. Without them, these games wouldn't be revered as they are. Zelda 1 had very simple dungeons, as did Zelda 2. Link to the Past dramatically improved the dungeon design by adding layers and gimmicks. Link's Awakening took a step back and refined the dungeon formula of the first game. And finally, we have Ocarina of Time being the first to work with a true 3D environment. I already went over the first dungeon, the Deku Tree, and how it works in such a way to get new people to understand how to even play a 3D environment. But by today's standards, it's a bit handholdy, but it's also short and should only take around 10 minutes to get through. Everything after that is fairly hands-off and lets the player figure it out for themselves. As you sneak into Hyrule Castle and speak with Zelda, you are directed towards Death Mountain to speak with the Gorons and help out there. This takes you to Dodongo's cavern, where monsters are preventing Gorons from getting food and their people are starving. I know the joke here is why can't they just eat the tons of rocks all over, but the answer is right in the game's manual. They don't simply eat rocks, but special minerals. It doesn't say anything beyond that, but I imagine it's a similar condition to how you can't just substitute a salad with grass and call it good. Dodongo's cavern is the worst of the child dungeons. The item you get in here are the bombs, which work exactly like you'd expect. There are tons of walls and things you need to blow up to traverse the entire dungeon, and while the fuse isn't super long, that amounts to a bunch of waiting. It's kind of shocking to see BMOs show up so quickly, but they aren't nearly as much of a threat as they used to be. They function the same, a rotating head that shoots a laser at you. Their range is severely limited from before, but the beam is also constant and they will track you a bit instead of a one and done type shot. They can still mess you up pretty quick if you aren't careful, but they can also be destroyed this time. Simply throw a bomb at them and they explode. I'm not sure why, probably has something to do with placement, but sometimes the bomb just stuns them. If this happens, just throw a second bomb and they're done. To start this dungeon, you head right and through a series of corridors with the ultimate goal being to reach this switch that will open up the left side. This is the main reason I'm not a fan, as I find the whole thing tedious at best. Other than progression, there's nothing rewarding over here that you can get as a child. In fact, one of the gold Skulltulas is hidden up and requires you to come back as an adult, which is just lame. The mini-boss is also on the right side, and you end up fighting this twice. It's just 2 Lizalfos, which aren't super difficult, but it's the fact that after you do a certain amount of damage, they become invincible and run away, while you're just forced to wait for them to come back. The platforms don't really add any extra challenge, just make sure you don't approach the edge while you're locked on, as Link won't properly make the jump. You end up back here when you get to the top level and have to fight them again, with all the same snores as the first fight had. After you get through those fights, you finally get the bombs. The next puzzle is pretty cool, since you have to drop the bombs down to blow up the eyes, which open the way to the next area. Then it's just traversing a couple of rooms to drop this block down, and finally you're facing off with the King Dodongo. This fight is, without a shadow of a doubt, the easiest boss in the whole game. Just like Dodongos from previous entries, you need to throw bombs into its mouth, which can be achieved when it starts to inhale for a fire attack. After you throw it in, just smack him and it gets up and starts rolling around. There's enough room before the lava where you can easily stand and he can't hit you during the roll, that you just have to chase him down and repeat it. Do it once more and King Dodongo is dethroned. There is zero threat with this boss, but it's over soon enough so it doesn't overstay its welcome. Unfortunately, the dungeon isn't over since you will have to come back inside in order to get 2 Skulltula tokens if you're going for 100%. There's this one at the top of some stairs you knock down, which can't be reached unless you reset and come back up through the shortcut you unlock, or just wait until you're an adult since the other one can't be reached unless you have the hookshot and Scarecrow's song to even get up to it. Aesthetically, it's definitely a cave. You've got rocks, a little bit of lava, and it all looks brown and bland. The music is even shared with the ambience from simple grottos, and maybe it was a decision based on cartridge space, but I would have at least liked a neat theme to listen to during the trek. At least the skull that's front and center in the main room looks cool. On top of being the fun little puzzle it is, it serves as the centerpiece to the entire dungeon, which that alone makes the dungeon a bit more memorable to me than it probably would have been if it was just another cave entrance. The final child dungeon, for now, fares a bit better than Dodongo's cavern. After feeding a small fish to a bigger fish, Link inadvertently ends up inside Jabu-Jabu's belly. At this point in the story, Link has been tasked with gathering the 3 sacred stones, the first of which was the emerald given to us after listening to the Deku tree story, and the ruby was granted to us after freeing the Goron's food supply. That just leaves us with one final stone, the Zora's sapphire. Unfortunately, it's been eaten by the giant fish Lord Jabu-Jabu as well as the king's daughter, Princess Ruto. Turns out, just like the great Deku tree, Ganondorf has come around these parts and placed a curse on the fish god, and much like the big tree, put a big monster inside. Instead of a giant bug, we have a giant stomach bug. But before any of that, we head inside the belly of the beast. We are in very different territory here, and it's quite a unique design for a dungeon. Instead of walls made of stone or wood, they're made of flesh that wriggles and writhes should you attack it, while sounds of agony play. The music really adds to this, with the drums sounding like a heartbeat in this droning sound alongside gurgling gut noises. It's unsettling. You're really inside of a giant fish god with a serious case of bubble guts. Even the switches aren't like normal switches, they look like some kind of sore in this poor creature. This is the kind of lasting atmosphere Dodongo's cavern wishes it could achieve. Shortly on after you enter, you meet this dungeon's main gimmick, Princess Ruto. She's a complete brat who begrudgingly allows you to assist her in not only escaping the beast, but find the sapphire. That's right, Ruto's also looking for the gem as it has an important significance to the Zora people that we learn at the end of the dungeon. She will not move on her own. You have to carry her through the dungeon. I'm not a huge fan of escort missions, which is pretty funny since one of my all-time favorite games is just a giant escort mission. But this one is simple enough and it's over before you know it. Plus, Gerudo serves some practical purpose in that she can be used as a weapon when thrown to activate switches or pop bubbles. Very quickly, you get the boomerang, which is used mostly to retrieve items out of your reach, which includes this singular Skulltula token that's all the way back in the Deku tree basement, behind the only wall that needs to be blown up in the entire dungeon, making Jabu-Jabu's belly the only dungeon that requires 0 backtracking to fully complete. After you get the boomerang, you need to use it to defeat these parasitic worm-like things that will progressively open up the rest of the dungeon. I guess the designers were concerned that players would grow too annoyed with Ruto hanging around, since only halfway through the dungeon she's gone. You enter this room and find a platform with a sapphire on it. Throwing Ruto up has her pick it up with an amusing dialogue box questioning why she gets it but not you. Regardless, the platform rises and Ruto is not seen again until you beat the dungeon, instead being replaced by this giant Octorok mini-boss. This fight is way better than the Lizalfos fight, simply because there's only one of it, and if you smack it in the back with just one Deku stick, it's down for the count. A couple rooms later and you're facing the boss, Baronade, and what a neat boss this is. It's got 3 phases to it, and I'd say each get progressively more difficult, but that's not exactly true. The first phase is simple. Use the boomerang to cut off its parasitic limbs to detach it from Jabu-Jabu. At this point, it sends out these electrified jellyfish that you need to dodge while trying to hit Baronade's center mass with your boomerang to stun it. Once stunned, you're able to take out the jellies. After they're defeated, Baronade begins spinning with even more electrified jellies. You take them out in the same way, then as a last-ditch effort to not lose its new source of nutrients, it continues to spin wildly while firing electric beams at you. Simply continue to stun it with the boomerang and attack it until it's finally defeated. Here's a fun little trick. At this phase, once you attack Baronade, it goes into the ground to shoot its electric beams at you. If you simply roll into it, the cycle gets skipped for some reason, and Baronade gets right back up so you can defeat it much more quickly. Once it goes down, Ruto is waiting for Link in the teleport, and the two make their escape. Ruto hands you a sapphire, signaling that it's basically the same thing as accepting a proposal, and the two are now engaged by Zora law. In one of Link's only character moments, there's a dialogue box explaining that he has no idea what any of that means, and it's time to run off to the Temple of Time and retrieve the Sword of Evil's Bane. So that's exactly what happens. Upon our return to the temple, we see Zelda and Impa fleeing the castle with Ganondorf right behind. He commits the ultimate error of not just murking us on the spot when Link is clearly incapable of fighting him at that time, and despite all this commotion, the town remains just as lively as ever. I don't know if they just weren't capable of creating a separate state for the town, or maybe they just didn't think about it, but this random mood whiplash of a moment always threw me off, even when I was a little younger. The princess just fled the castle through the front gate. It's not like they took some back alley exit and avoided the crowd. Either way, while they fled, Zelda, sort of, presented us with the final key to unlock the stone door, the Ocarina of Time itself. For gameplay purposes, it's nothing more than a recolor of the one given to you by Saria, but in terms of the world, it is very much needed. With all 3 spiritual stones in hand, Link plays the Song of Time on his new ocarina, and the door opens, allowing you to grab the Master Sword. Just like Link to the Past, there's a big fancy cutscene, but when we do it, it is revealed that this is exactly what Ganondorf wanted all along. After opening the seal and vanishing, Ganondorf was able to waltz in and take the Triforce of Power. The next thing we see is that Link is now an adult. After pulling the Master Sword, we ended up in the Chamber of Sages. I'm not entirely sure where this is, but I've always believed that it's likely just some sort of magical realm with ties to the Temple of Time. We're greeted by Rauru, one of the 6 sages who are supposed to be guarding the sacred realm, who informs us of what is going on. Basically, while Link was sleeping, Ganondorf took over everything and is now in search of the other 2 pieces of the Triforce, one being the Triforce of Wisdom, which is currently being held by Zelda, and the other being bestowed onto our hero, Link. The next goal is simple: visit a bunch of temples and awaken the rest of the sages. That's basically it as far as story goes until we get to Ganondorf's castle. As we travel around Hyrule, we can see the devastation left behind by Ganondorf. Castletown is now in ruins. All its populace have been turned into the undead. Even taking into account later Zelda games, this is still pretty unsettling. That's not all that's happened though. Returning to Link's home, we see the Kokiri Forest is swarming with monsters. Kakariko Village is being tormented by an evil spirit that was once sealed away into this seemingly innocuous well, though I guess because there are still things that can be done in the village, all the damage and fires are immediately undone after the cutscene. Zora's domain has been completely frozen over. The Gorons have been captured and imprisoned inside Death Mountain to be fed to a giant dragon. Mario lost control of his farm to Luigi. Even Lake Hylia has been affected, with it being almost completely drained. Hyrule is a mere shadow of the kingdom it once was. The only areas left untouched are the Gerudo lands, and that's not surprising considering that we find out that every 100 years a man is born amongst the all-female tribe, and that happened to be Ganondorf. Well, we can't just leave the world like this, so it's off to our first destination, the Ice Cavern. One of the things I gave Link to the Past credit for was when it got to this phase of the game, you could really go do whatever you want. I have no problem with linearity in a game. In fact, I largely prefer it. But I was curious to see just how much I could change up Ocarina of Time without creating a ton of backtracking. After you return to Hyrule, definitely not Zelda, Sheik points us towards the direction of the Forest Temple. I decided I wanted to get to the Water Temple first, but that required me to get the Iron Boots from the Ice Cavern. The Ice Cavern itself isn't locked behind any sort of progression item, and I'm easily able to go from there to the Water Temple. I begin my trek through it, only to be completely unable to get the boss key. I ended up missing a single key that was locked behind a puzzle that would have required me to get the bow, which is inside the Forest Temple. I tried performing some complicated glitches to get me past the gate, but either I was doing it wrong, it's not possible on SOH, or more than likely trying to pull off complicated glitches requires more than half an hour's worth of attempts. So, needless to say, I had to abandon my endeavors and go where I was directed to. That's not to say everything is strictly linear, though you do have some degree of freedom with how you approach the major temples. Ignoring major glitches, you really do need to go to the Forest Temple first, as the bow is essential to completing most of the following temples. I think you could get away with doing the Fire Temple first, but you'll need to do the Forest, Fire, and Water before you can get the cutscene for Kakariko to trigger, which is the only method of reaching the Shadow Temple, and to do the Spirit Temple, you need to have finished the Forest Temple so Sheik will move out of the way and let you put the Master Sword back, which sends Link back in time to just before he pulls it. So if you really like the somewhat more open approach in Link to the Past, I'm afraid to tell you that's not really here, but again, it's not really a downside as you'll need to finish all of these temples at some point anyway. It's about time I go over these temples and give them my thoughts. I'll be going over them in order of what I would typically do, but do note that I still tried my best to do things in a weird order, so if it seems like the gear I have doesn't typically match up, that's why. To kick things off, we have the Forest Temple. This is the sole reason I recommend getting the Scarecrow song at all. To get to the temple, you need to travel through the Lost Woods, tell Mido to take a hike, and navigate through the Sacred Forest Meadow. As a child, this was pretty simple, as the pathway was just covered with Deku scrubs whose shots could be easily avoided or tanked. As an adult, these have been replaced by moblins, making this their only appearance in the entire game. It's also a stealth section, since if you get caught, they charge with a spear and knock you back. They can be defeated if you manage to hit their back, but by far the easiest way to get around them is to use the Scarecrow song and just hook shot above the pathway. They can't do anything as long as you stay up there. The only one you'll have to contend with is the big guy who attacks the ground and sends out a shockwave that sends you flying back if you get hit by it. Once you get around, it can't seem to turn around and becomes no threat at all. Anytime we first get to a temple, Sheik appears and teaches us a song that allows us to warp back to it. You'd think this would help mitigate my issues with the size of Hyrule, and it does to a certain degree, but of the 6 warp songs that are learned, I find that 3 have decent locations, with the Prelude of Light being the most useful, and the Serenade of Water and Nocturne of Shadow also being in decent locations, though I do wish that the Serenade had its warp point by the entrance to the lake instead of on top of the temple at the very far side. The other 3 are just in awkward locations that could be more useful. I don't really think there's much more that could be done for the forest temple warp. Much like the lake, it could probably work better if it was at the beginning of the area, but then you'd have to go through the moblin corridors every single time you wanted to get back to it. At least with having a trek back, you only have to get past the big moblin and then just climb this ladder so you can get on top without any hassle. The fire temple warp is much closer to any area that you'd want to get to, but in order to actually get off the rock you're on, you will either need to use your hook shot to hit this bridge or use the hover boots, which you won't get until much later. Technically, you can use this bean patch to fly over, but unless you're going for full completion, this patch will probably be ignored. Again, it's all just personal preference, but I would have preferred it being on the other side of the broken bridge in front of the entrance to the Goron city. Lastly, there's the warp to the spirit temple, and there's not really anything that can be done with it. Unlike the other ones that have some slight utility beyond getting to their temples, this one simply serves that purpose and nothing more. Overall, these songs can cut down on travel time, but there are still a few places that could have benefited from having a warp, namely Zora's domain. Back to the temples. We're now in the forest temple, which is often hailed as one of, if not the best temple in the game. While it's not my personal favorite, I really do enjoy running through this. The main objective within this temple is to retrieve the flames of these torches stolen by 4 ghosts. As you traverse the temple, you'll find their portraits that you need to shoot in order for them to come out. They aren't too difficult. The third one requires you to solve this puzzle to get it to show up, but aside from a mostly generous timer, it goes down all the same. The final ghost does step things up a bit. Before you encounter it, you actually find it crying over the torches since you've killed its friends. When you start the fight, the ghost splits into 4 and you need to find the correct one. If you pay enough attention, the real ghost will actually spin before circling around you. If you take too long to attack the wrong ghosts, you'll end up taking damage. After enough hits, the ghost is defeated and the central elevator to the boss is once again usable. This temple is a great hit, and I really appreciate the step up in difficulty and especially its aesthetic. It's an abandoned temple deep in the Lost Woods where souls go to die, long since abandoned. It's fallen into such disrepair that the entire stairway is completely crumbled and the walls are covered in vegetation. Monsters have taken up residence, all being invasive creatures like the giant Deku Baba or spirits that haunt the place. Unlike the previous 3 dungeons, this is the first one that makes me stop and wonder about the location that I am actually in. Who inhabited this place? What was its purpose? Given that those who end up lost in the Lost Woods die and become Stalfos, is this just a place for them to flock? You sure do fight a lot of them traversing the temple. How long has the temple been around for? When you're here as a child, the stairs are already destroyed, implying that it was left to rot long before even our hero was born. There are a couple rooms that seem to just be prison cells. Was this a kingdom, much like Hyrule? Was it conquered, and due to the nature of the Lost Woods left abandoned since occupying it would pose a risk to those involved? What if the Lost Woods was a cursed place after the inhabitants were killed or driven out and sprang up around the temple as a sort of defensive mechanism to keep the invaders out? It's mysteries like these that I'd really like to see official answers for. I even wonder if it was thought out that much during development, or if I'm just looking far too deep into something that serves no purpose to gameplay or narrative. The music really adds to that mystique as well. Just like the spirits within, it's haunting, and I love what sounds like screams that break in as if the very temple itself is in pain. If anyone has definitive knowledge or even just more theories, please, I implore you to leave comments. Explain your ideas. I'd love to see what other people have come up with, or if there's even something concrete that I just don't know about. It's not an entirely flawless dungeon though. The main flow is nice. There are essentially 2 rings, one inner and one outer, and you'll go through them in a left to right fashion. Unfortunately, there are a couple spots that if you don't know a few tricks to get around them that break this flow, and you make a couple extra loops through a few rooms. I'm also not a fan of this bigger room where you need to push these massive blocks to allow Link to climb up to the top. Thanks to SOH, however, pushing blocks isn't nearly as tedious of a task as it is in vanilla, since we can increase the speed of both moving blocks and climbing ladders. I debated on messing with Link's climbing speed under the thought of, does this change the core gameplay too much? But ultimately there aren't really any areas where climbing at 10 times speed will give you an advantage other than some time saved. I can think of 2 areas that probably popped into your head, but we're not there just yet. The boss of this temple is Phantom Ganondorf. It's exactly what it sounds like, a fake Ganondorf who is ultimately just a test so the real one can gauge Link's strength and do some simple threat assessment. The first phase is awesome. Phantom goes into one of the paintings that are all over the walls and gallops away. When he comes back, there's a fake Phantom in one of the paintings that's made to distract you. There are 2 ways to tell which is fake. Either listen for the galloping horse, or figure out the slight difference between the real and fake Phantom. Once you find the real one, you need to quickly shoot him before he jumps out of the painting and attacks you. Doing so enough times will have him abandon his horse and he begins flying around the area. The Phantom will then shoot lightning balls at you and thus begins a rousing game of energy tennis. I found that the easiest way to deal with this is to stand directly under him and just spam the spin attack, as it almost always seems to just reflect it right back, especially if he's down lower. Trying to do it properly doesn't feel quite right. A lot of the time, the energy balls just seem to go wherever they want, and I'm not really sure what it is that I'm doing wrong. After Phantom Ganondorf is defeated, the real one just scoffs and banishes it to some sort of hellish purgatory realm between realms, where the poor thing spends eternity in a dimension that's probably similar to the white one Squidward ends up in during that freaky time travel episode.
I gotta get out of here!
Overall, this dungeon is just fantastic from beginning to end. Sure, it's got a couple little blemishes, but otherwise it's a solid entry, and compared to the other temples, it makes for a perfect point of entry to what is essentially the part of the game where the gloves really come off. Next up, we have the Fire Temple, and I won't linger on it too long because quite frankly, I don't like this temple. In fact, I'd even go as far as to say that it's my least favorite of the entire game. Most of that likely comes from the fact that this is the spot I got stuck at for the longest of times when I played this at a younger age. I wasn't exactly paying much attention to things like dialogue, or even really utilizing the map feature, and I would end up getting stuck because I was missing a key. Fast forward to now, and I have no problem navigating the temple, I just don't like it or any of its puzzles. Let's start with the elephant in the room, the structure. Despite being located in Death Mountain Crater, which is located in the peak of the mountain, this temple is very vertical, with you climbing up the entire time. I don't mind verticality. In fact, I find it to be a nice change of pace from more sprawling level design. But to make a crude comparison, the Fire Temple's verticality is less Tower of the Gods and more Ice Temple. What's probably my least favorite element about it is the entire center section. At the base, you've got this wide open room with a reason to traverse to the other side. It's not difficult, but the reason I dislike it is that every floor above it has some form of pit that if you fall into it, you end up here. One of those rooms that immediately comes to mind is this one right here with an awkwardly thin and jagged path. This is the first instance where if you fall here, you need to make the trek all the way back. These ledges aren't able to be grabbed either, so you can't save yourself, unlike other areas, if you make a mistake. There are 2 other rooms with similar puzzles to each other that feature a drop back to here. Moving from this, we have the next part that makes falling worse, and it's this room where you need to push this block onto a fire jet that makes it act as an elevator. I don't mind the concept, it's a neat idea, but every single time you come here, you need to push this block because it resets. Fall down, reset. Leave the game because you're an adult and time is not unlimited like when you were a child. Reset. Need to exit the temple for any reason? Reset. Die? You guessed it. Reset. Once again, SOH does help with the increased pushing speed, but I don't see why this couldn't just be a permanently solved puzzle. The block pushing room in the Forest Temple stays solved. Why can't this one? While I'm on the subject, there's another room a bit later that has the same issue. You need to climb up to this block in order to push it down and drag it so you can jump to the other side. It's the exact same story where anytime you need to come back to this room, the block resets back to its original position. It's for this reason that I would strongly recommend that if you're approaching this temple with limited time, that you make your way to the midway shortcut as soon as possible. This may not stop you from needing to push the first block, but the entrance is located at the second and saves a bit of time getting back up. Just use caution when descending, since the drop will cost some health if you don't use the provided ladder. I have indeed died jumping down, and it's a real flick in the nuts. The rest of the temple just doesn't do anything for me. There's this boulder maze that isn't complicated to navigate, but the sentient rocks do get in the way and will knock you back if you collide with them. There's no threat of losing progression sans death, but they are quite a nuisance. If you're going for a 100% playthrough though, the Scarecrow song is required in here as it grants you access to a secret room where you need to activate this switch and get to a chest before time runs out. On a normal playthrough, the timing is very strict. I've never been great at first-person aiming, and I believe they intended on you hookshotting this pillar to get through the room faster, but I always end up sliding down this hill, which essentially means you've lost. That, or hit it wrong, and you'll end up falling into the pit, which sends you right back down, and we all know how fun that is. There's this room just before that isn't much of a threat, but it did unnerve me when I was younger. After jumping on this grate, a firewall forms, and you must run from it. It's not hard to get away, and you can even climb on one of these pillars as it harmlessly drifts by. There's another maze, except this time it's a fire maze. Navigating this is much more annoying if you don't know what the intended route is, since you navigate between these pillars and some fire can shoot up if it's the wrong path. Touching them has the same effect as a boulder sending you backwards. You have to navigate a bit more slowly though, as the reaction time is pretty insane if you're just going full tilt. After that, you've got a mini boss, which you need to fight twice, and I don't like it either time. The Flame Dancer is cool looking, but the process to fight it just isn't fun. If you're like me and prefer to use the Bigoron sword, a two-handed sword that deals much more damage at the cost of not being able to use a shield when holding it, then make sure to switch to the Master Sword before taking it on, because for some reason it's like the damage is flipped. At least the actual boss is kind of neat. The reason all the Gorons are locked up inside the temple in the first place is because Ganondorf put them there and is beating them to the fire-breathing worm Volvagia. The fight is a giant game of whack-a-mole, and I find that to be very amusing. After smacking it in the head, Volvagia flies up into the sky and will either shoot flames at you or drop big rocks on your head. While dodging the traditional way isn't too difficult, the whole fight can actually be cheesed by simply hanging off the side of the arena. I don't know why, but this makes Volvagia skip the fire stage entirely and just go straight back into a hole. It doesn't skip the rocks, but they will never hit you if you do this. I can't quite leave the Fire Temple alone without mentioning the controversy surrounding it. It probably stood out to everyone watching, but SOH does not run on the original version of Ocarina of Time. For those who don't know, the original version of the game features some iconography and music that has been altered in any version that was published later. Namely, this image used for the Gerudo tribe was altered from a crescent moon and star to something completely different, and the music to the Fire Temple was altered and these chants were removed. Both of these changes occurred due to their similarities to religion, which isn't the first time something in a Zelda game has been altered for that reason. I've heard and seen both, and frankly, I don't see what the big deal was. The crescent moon image just makes me think of the Ottoman Empire more so than religion, and the chants are just chants. Many religions involve chants in some form or fashion, and I don't see the harm here. Personally, I did not grow up with these, as my copy of Ocarina of Time already had them altered. While I find censorship in games to be especially silly, I find that a lot of the time they are often just unnecessary, and the anger surrounding them to be equally so. Personally, I don't mind the change to the symbol, and I just don't like the theme to the fire temple, so adding in 5 seconds of ominous chanting will not save it there. I'm sorry to all the fans of this one out there, but I just don't ever look forward to this part. The water temple is probably the most polarizing part of this game. For starters, before you can even get to it properly, you need to head to the ice cavern. The ice cavern isn't anything special and can be blown through in a few minutes. You can choose to knock it out as soon as you become an adult if you really want, but I'd recommend having at least 2 bottles before entering, which, if you're actually playing the game, is all but guaranteed. The gimmick is a throwaway gimmick that never comes back until the end of the game, and it's blue fire. You bottle it up and use it to melt this red ice that blocks your path and covers certain objects, including the King of the Zoras, who grants you a blue tunic for doing so that allows Link to breathe underwater. It's not necessary for the upcoming temple, but it is very helpful. The actual award from the cavern are the iron boots, which sink Link to the bottom of water mafia style. Now, it's no secret that the water temple is very divided amongst fans of the game. I've seen it lambasted as the worst dungeon in the game, even going as far as seeing it called the worst dungeon in the entire franchise. I've seen people who are entirely indifferent to it, and there are people who actually enjoy it, but the popular consensus is that it's just bad. At risk of being called a contrarian, I actually really enjoy this dungeon. I'm sure part of it is the revelation of being able to finally make progress after being stuck in the fire temple, but even when I was younger, I never looked down on the water temple. I don't particularly care for the ice cavern, but that's over so quickly it's a mildly annoying diversion more than anything. The water temple is located underneath this mound in the back of Lake Hylia, and unlike the fire temple, its geometry makes sense within the space it occupies. It's also vertical, but instead of going up where there's nothing, it goes down deeper into the earth. The water temple is very relaxing, and while there are plenty of threats to be found, overall the environment is surprisingly not hostile. Right away, you've got this super chill music that washes right over you, lulling you into some sort of trance. Slow down, let the flow of the water take you. Instead of a whitewater rafting adventure, you're about to float down a lazy river in a giant tube. And float you will, because this temple's pace is pretty slow. I think the number one complaint people have is just how often you will be pausing the game to take on and off the iron boots. And it would be a bit of a drag if you were playing the original game. SOH and Ocarina 3DS both fix this issue by allowing you to set the boots as an item rather than being forced to open the menu each time. On top of that, the menus themselves simply load faster. That doesn't change how the dungeon is progressed though. You will still find yourself sinking and swimming up, constantly climbing out of the water, and while I never thought it was too bad, I've seen some complaints about the layout being confusing. Trust me, it's not actually that confusing. There are quite a few doors that can be opened earlier than intended, but if you're missing something, you can't get too far in without it. I can think of one spot where I did get stuck before, but that's because much like the fire temple, I just missed a key. The bigger difference is, the key I was missing had a really obvious cutscene associated with its location that gets played when you up the water level to the middle level. That's the main gimmick of this temple. You will need to raise and lower the water level between 3 different heights in order to overcome certain obstacles or make certain rooms accessible. Each area that will change the levels is marked with an image of the Triforce and will require you to play Zelda's Lullaby to change it. It's yet another time sink, but I don't find it too egregious. It's one of those things where it can be rough going on your first playthrough, but if you simply use your map and formulate a game plan, it shouldn't hamper things too much. This temple is absolutely stunning to look at. It's positively awash with the water motif, and the extra flourishes the 3DS remake add just to make it look all the better. I don't have footage to show unfortunately, but give it a look. The only thing I'm not a fan of with that particular version are the added graphics that show where the water level will change. I just think they look goofy, albeit I do get their practicality. Of course, it's also the only temple where the mini-boss is more iconic than the actual boss itself. As you adventure around, you will end up in this seemingly endless reflecting pool area with a lone island in the center. As you approach, there's nothing there, but once you turn around, you find Shadow Link. I love the trope of having to fight yourself in both a metaphorical and literal sense. This fight is not quite as difficult as the fight in Zelda 2, but it does still offer up challenge, though not in a way I'm particularly fond of. I don't recall having issue with it when I was younger, but lately, anytime I fight Shadow Link, I end up just cheesing him. There are a number of ways that you can hit him. I find stunning him with a Deku nut seems to work the best. Going at it with a Master Sword seems to be a foolish endeavor. I know it's possible, but if you use it, Shadow Link will mirror your attacks, and I find that this leads to me getting hit more than he does. Not only that, but if you do the stab move, it will jump on your blade and sometimes get a free hit in. I'm not entirely sure what's going on there, but this fight can be pretty rough if you're not prepared. Fun fact though, this is a literal copy of Link. That means if you've been going around and collecting a bunch of extra health, then Shadow Link will also have more health. It's fascinating, really. If you're doing a 3-heart challenge, a self-imposed challenge where you ignore all health pickups, then Shadow Link will go down in just 2 to 3 swings if you use the Goron sword. The actual boss of the temple, sadly, doesn't hold a candle to Shadow Link, but for one very simple reason, it's still rather enjoyable. Morpha is this red blob that can seemingly manipulate water and does so to attack Link. In order to hurt it, you need to hookshot it out of its water tentacles and then attack it. It's rather bland, but it can easily be trapped in a corner, and as long as you don't give it any room to escape, this boss is over in seconds. So you won't have to deal with long invincibility time periods like you do with Volvagia. While it's not my favorite in the game, I really do enjoy this temple and always do look forward to a revisit. It's relaxing. The puzzles aren't taxing, and I just don't mind that it requires me to take my time to get through it. Also, as an extra fun fact, you very early on run into Princess Ruto in here. There's no extra escort mission in this, you won't have to worry about that. She basically just goes, "How dare you make me wait all this time," reminds you that you're actually married. Not counting Ganondorf's castle, there are 2 more temples to go. At this point in the game, I believe the intended route is to go from the water to the spirit temple, but you can really tackle either it or the shadow temple at any point since you have the means to complete both. Let's get the Shadow Temple out of the way since it's my least favorite between the two, though both make actual use of the game's central theme of time. Before you can even get to the Shadow Temple, you head over to Kakariko Village, where it turns out that the seal on the town's well has been broken and allowed an evil spirit to break free. It proceeds to pummel Sheik and runs off to the graveyard. Some of the buildings seem to also be on fire, but again, as soon as the scene is over, it's like it never happened in the first place. A bit odd, but as I said before, I'm sure it's to make sure the player doesn't lose out on getting anything from the village. After Sheik gets up, you're taught the Nocturne of Shadow, the warp song that allows you to actually get to the temple. Unlike other temples, you can't reach this one by conventional means. It's located in the back of the village's graveyard, but there aren't any stairs or ladders to get there. I kind of wish there was a bit more to it, but instead we just have a simple light all the torches puzzle. Thankfully, once it's been opened, it doesn't close again, so it's not just a magic check every time you enter the temple. Remember how I said the temple made use of the game's time mechanic? Well, it does, but it's not mandatory. You can just go straight into the Shadow Temple from here, and it's possible to fully complete it, but there are plenty of invisible enemies, chests, platforms, and obstacles that make it rough if you don't know how to navigate them. To solve this, you need the Lens of Truth, which is located in the bottom of the well. You can't get to the well as an adult as it's caved in after the spirit got out, and as a child it's full of water, and even having the golden scale for maximum diving ability won't get you there. Instead, Link must create a paradox to be able to get inside the well. If you talk to the man inside the windmill, he's all grumpy because some kid a while back played a song that made the windmill spin so fast it somehow drained it. He's so mad about it, in fact, that he decides to show it to you because he hates it and the effect so much. Naturally, this kid is Link, but in the past. With this knowledge, Link then goes back in time and plays the Song of Storms, which does exactly as described, allowing him to get inside the bottom of the well. Like the Fire Temple, I just don't like this one very much. It's more akin to a mini dungeon like the Ice Cavern, but it's more of a pain to navigate. That is assuming you want everything inside, since the only thing you need to do is go to the back, drain the water again, then fight the dead hand enemy to get the lens. You don't need to open a single door, chest, or fight any other enemies, and you can just bounce right out. This is exactly what I did, though it came at a cost later during the cleanup phase. There are reasons I dislike this dungeon, and it really boils down to my experiences dealing with it early on. Nowadays, I can navigate this dungeon no problem, but man, those first few times when I had to deal with all these pits located throughout that dump you into the basement were a pain. Not to mention, every time you want to get out, you will get screamed at by this re-dead. I've never had an issue with it killing me, but the scream stuns Link, and getting to the ladder leaves you just in range to get yelled at, but it's more, "Get off my lawn!" than, "I'm going to kill you." Personal grievances aside, atmospherically, this is another dungeon that I can't help but ponder the mystery behind it. Obviously, this well isn't exactly for drinking water. This whole area is clearly a torture chamber. It's filled with creepy crawly spirit monsters and littered with dark imagery that is in stark contrast to the rest of the game. Not to say the game is all sunshine and rainbows, but up until now, the Zelda games have never depicted scenes quite this intense. I can't help but wonder, do the people above actually know what lies here? I also like that the bottom floor that you can only access by falling to looks like a creature falling down itself. It's the only positive to the punishment that is missing the pit. After that pleasant journey, it's time to turn back into an adult and take on the Shadow Temple proper. You can go inside as a child, but there's a gap right at the entrance that young Link is incapable of crossing without the use of glitches, as you'll need either the hookshot or hover boots, which Link gets in this very dungeon. The mysteries that surround the bottom of the well are intertwined with the Shadow Temple. It has the same gruesome imagery, though this feels like it's more intended to be where prisoners are locked away after their visit to the bottom of the well. Not only is it located in the graveyard right behind the royal family's tomb, but it's tucked away in the ground behind it with no clear and easy path to access. In terms of an actual temple, it's fine. I don't mind the overall forward progression, but there are a few points I'm just not a fan of. Let's start with some positives though. This temple's theme is creepy and fits the atmosphere to a T. The instruments are haunting, and the vocals used in it don't exactly sound like singing, but more like groans and howls. It uses both male and female pitch, implying that there was no bias to whatever poor soul found themselves on a one-way trip here. I really do enjoy the hover boots. It's a fun mechanic, and I really hope that they make a return at some point in the future. They only allow Link to hover for a few seconds on air, but you can still cover more ground than you would with a simple jump. This boat ride is pretty neat, and I like the boss, Bongo Bongo. Bongo Bongo was the spirit that laid the smackdown on Sheik, and it is a freaky looking thing. Supposedly, this used to be some form of human and is speculated to have been tortured in this very temple. I'm not sure exactly why they decided to try and seal it in the well instead of back here, but considering the well is very obviously just a cover-up for Hyrule's more gruesome past, mayhaps there was something in the temple that they couldn't risk it getting to. Either way, you fight this monster on top of a giant bongo. To defeat it, you need to shoot its hands and then hit its big glowing neck hole to stun it. It's not all that difficult, and as you can see, it's easy to defeat even without using the lens of truth to see the main body. That's about it for the positives. Some of these rooms aren't exactly my favorite to navigate. I never look forward to this hallway. It just has too many giant Skulltulas that drop down and halt your progress to take them out. Luckily, by the time you're here, you should have the Megaton hammer from the Fire Temple, so you could just take them head on without waiting for them to turn around, and it is a little bit satisfying. Everything else is harmless at worst. Nothing too stand out, but that's not exactly a bad thing either. The Shadow Temple is definitely a longer temple than some of the previous ones, but that's what I'd ultimately consider it, harmless. finally, we've got the Spirit Temple. I won't mince words. This is by far and away my favorite temple in the entire game and one of my favorites in the whole series. It's also one of the only temples that I think is genuinely improved in the Master Quest, but that's for an entirely different video. That's right, I know it exists, I just have plans for it later. If you watched my video on the first Zelda game and wondered why I didn't mention Second Quest, it's the same ordeal. So, what makes this temple so special to me? For starters, it has the best use of the game's time theme. When you come across it at first, there is nothing you can do here. On the right side, you're blocked by this giant brick that Link is too weak to move, and on the left, there's a hole in the wall that he's too tall to enter. With nothing else to do, simply head back out and Sheik teaches you the Requiem of Spirit so you can warp back here. This is my favorite Ocarina song in the game. You need this song to reach the temple as a child since the Gerudo blocked the bridge to get here, and even if you were somehow able to cross it, there's a giant gate that won't open and young Link is incapable of crossing the desert. Once you return, there's actually a Gerudo woman in here named Nabooru, which I just learned is pronounced Naboru, which I don't particularly like as much, but considering Titus from Final Fantasy X has only been officially pronounced as Titus in any game that I'm aware of, this doesn't seem so bad. Anyway, Naboru is seen looking into the small hole in the wall, but is disappointed that she can't quite fit inside. Seeing Link is just the right size, she recruits the young hero to go inside and get her the treasure she seeks. For some reason, we agree and head inside. This dungeon is broken up into two paths, the child and adult side, though adult Link is able to get to about half of the child side. I enjoy navigating the child side. You start by making sure to equip the Hylian shield since you've lost many Deku shields to these burning bat bastards, and proceed to slaughter every enemy in this room. Then it's just looping around until you have the key to proceed to the next area. There are 3 rooms in this loop, and 2 of them can be tackled in a couple different ways. The first room is easily the most dangerous as your main opponent is a Stalfos warrior who feels huge compared to facing them as an adult. He's definitely a lot harder too, though if you're quick on your feet, he can be stunned long enough to get a somewhat precise shot on the switch that lowers the bridge to the next room. And there we have an enemy that's unique to the Spirit Temple, Anubis. These things are menacing, but not very threatening. For the most part, they just float around and get in the way, but they do have a fireball attack that they occasionally use. I'm not entirely sure what triggers it, but I promise they do have it. The only way to defeat fire is with fire of your own, and the room offers you 2 different ways to do it. Remember these annoying enemies in Link to the Past that mirror your movements? These guys do the same, only they float around the room. To defeat them, they need to be burned. This can either be done by activating the fire trap in the room and walking them into it, or simply using one of your own fire-based weapons. This ensures that regardless of having magic or not, the room can be completed, you just need to go through a slightly more difficult process to do it. The final room isn't too special, it's just collect the silver rupees, defeat the bats, and get the key. After doing so, you end up in the central room to the temple. This is where the 2 sides meet, and in the center is a massive statue that hides the boss chamber. As a child, we stick to the left side where there's a simple room that requires you to move this block with a sun in it to light and open the door. The Beamos in here aren't much of a threat, but can be just as easily taken out if you don't want to deal with them at all. After that, we come face to face with a criminally underrepresented enemy in the franchise, the Iron Knuckle. Having only appeared in Zelda 2, this is a hard-hitting, heavily armored opponent. It has 2 phases. Its first phase has it slowly approach and swing its axe around at Link. It's one of the hardest hitting enemies in the game, knocking off a whopping 4 heart, making them especially deadly if you've got the damage up or going for a 3 heart run. Once you damage them enough, they drop their armor and begin running faster. At times it feels like they strike faster, but I'm not 100% certain about that. Regardless, this ends up being an enemy that kills me more often due to complacency than anything. They may hit hard, but the attacks are pretty simple to avoid and it only has 2. If you're not comfortable timing an attack after it does the double swing, just wait for an overhead strike that will give you plenty of time to approach. Just don't get greedy. If you've got a surplus of bomb chews, I recommend using them as a child since your weaker sword and lesser range of attack will put you closer into harm's way. After you defeat the Iron Knuckle, you're free to head out to the goddess's hand that will grant you the silver gauntlet that Noboru sent you in for. But alas, she will never receive these as she gets abducted by Kotake and Koome, who are witches that have taken over the spirit temple and also happen to be Ganondorf's surrogate mothers. Yes, they both are, and it'll make sense in a little bit. Travel back to the future and we are now old enough to adorn the silver gauntlets. This works just like the Goron's bracelet you get before the Dodongo's cavern in that it's just a progression gate and doesn't actually serve a real utility purpose. Those big blocks that you were unable to push before can now be pushed and pulled to your heart's content. Getting past that brings you to a room that's similar to the child side, but instead of making a nice loop to take us to the center, it's simply 2 different paths. One that'll grant you the map, and one side gives you the key. The room to get the key is a bit odd. It's just collecting 5 silver rupees, but with the exception of this floating one, they're all in these divots in the wall that have an abrupt camera shift that you don't really see much in this game. The boulders aren't a real challenge to avoid, but I have definitely bit the dust a fair few times trying to pick up this golden Skulltula. Because of the camera shift, I find myself doing a face plant, and since I often play on 4 times damage, that means I'm dealing with a lot of extra damage. After that, we once again end up back in the mountain room with the statue. There's a lot more that can be done here as an adult, including opening the midway shortcut, which I would recommend, though unlike the fire or shadow temple, the trek isn't quite as long should anything happen on your adventure. Heading up, we are challenged with another Anubis room. There's a lone Beamos, but it might as well just be a target practice for bomb throwing. Once again, the Anubis can either be taken out with a fire tool, or you can use the switch to summon a fire pillar and lure them into it. This one requires a bit more thinking though, as there's a hidden song and time block that you'll need to summon in order to get one into the flame. Personally, I find it way more satisfying to get all 3 in one blast of Din's fire. If that doesn't happen, then it's just a waste of magic. The next room is kind of neat, as it makes you think out of the box a bit, since you need to activate this switch, but it needs constant pressure. None of these Armo statues are actually statues, so you need to get one to stand on it and be quick enough to slip through the door. Another fight with an Iron Knuckle and you get the Mirror Shield, which is still a bit underutilized, but unlike other games, it is actually used for puzzle solving. When standing in these sunlight spots, Link can reflect the light, allowing him the ability to activate sun switches that he normally wouldn't be able to, as well as being used against the boss. Before we get to that, I want to talk about one last room, and it's the shifting wall area. This is another room that can be tackled in more than one way. Firstly, there's the obvious way of just climbing up. This is the only spot in the game where having the climbing speed set higher than default will put you in a massive advantage, as the challenge is timing it so you're not placed between the two rows as they shift side to side. Doing so will cause Link to fall off and you'll have to start again. Challenging and a bit awkward, but completely doable. Alternatively, you can just use the hook shot, which should be the long shot by now, and just skip the entire puzzle and move on. This is brilliant, and I really wish that we'd get more utility out of our items in this way. I think overall Ocarina of Time does a good job at making use of our equipment that we pick up along the way, but this is the exact kind of thing I want to see more of. Not every puzzle needs to have a cheesy solution, but it's super satisfying to overcome a challenge by simply remembering that your equipment exists. Once we get up the moving wall, it's just a matter of shifting a couple mirrors and sending this platform down to the area below, where, through the power of really intense sunlight, we crumble the statue's face, revealing the boss chamber. Before facing the boss, we fight one more Iron Knuckle, only for it to be Naboru. That's right. After she was kidnapped by the twins, she was brainwashed and made super aggressive. Seeing as she was the leader of the Gerudo before Ganondorf was born, this is probably why the group became super aggressive. Finally, it's time to face off against the twins in what can either be a simple fight or a frustrating fight. I like the idea. You need to use the mirror shield to deflect the attack of one into the other. The problem with it comes in how they move and the hit detection of the attack itself. Getting the attack to deflect isn't a real issue. Simply just crouch and aim your shield at the one that's about to attack. The issue comes with sending it at the other one. Most of the time, it does connect. However, there have been plenty of times where I either just don't get a chance since the other sister is avoiding Link's range of motion, or I just can't seem to make the hit connect even though it looks like it should have. When it does hit though, I always feel like I'm just slapping them with a magic beam, and it's quite funny. Thankfully, they have a shared health pool, so once you hit them enough times, they will pull a Dragon Ball and become Twin Rova. This phase may seem more intimidating, but it's actually much easier. In this phase, Twin Rova will either choose to shoot fire or ice at you. Unlike the beams, this doesn't reflect from your shield, but rather charges it for some reason. Absorb 3 of the same element, and it will fire a burst of it at Twin Rova. When she's down for the count, jump in and start slashing. If you haven't already done it, I'd recommend grabbing the Big Goron sword, as it can easily defeat her in one cycle. If you didn't manage to do it though, just make sure you pay attention to what element she throws at you, since if you absorb the opposite element, your shield will reset. After she is defeated, the twins are now super dead as they begin their ascension to the afterlife. This scene always makes me chuckle as they come to realize that they're dead, then begin arguing with each other in the exact way siblings do. I love this dungeon from beginning to end. It exhibits what I want out of a dungeon, which is the ability to tackle puzzles with more than one option. On top of that, it truly makes use of the time travel by having both sides interact with the same temple. My only further wish would have been a more direct interaction, maybe with some sort of magic mirror that would allow you to switch between child and adult so long as you remain within the temple itself. With that, the final sage is freed, and it's time to head back and defeat Ganondorf once and for all, is what I like to say, but as I mentioned several times earlier, I decided to 100% the game this time, and that means we've got some cleanup to do before heading off to face the Prince of Darkness. Now, it's not as if I just saved every single optional thing to this point, but I did leave some things unfinished because I knew I wasn't going to enjoy them. For starters, there's the Gerudo's training ground. A completely optional dungeon. You get the ability to enter it after going through the Gerudo Fortress and freeing all the carpenters. Pay the gate girl 10 rupees and you get to go inside. 10 is not a lot, but you need to do this every time you enter, so you're best off doing it in one shot. The actual dungeon itself is kind of fun. It offers a variety of challenges that make decent use of the items you've acquired during your adventures. Other than combat, you'll make use of the following: bombs, arrows, megaton hammer, hookshot, silver gauntlets, lens of truth, and iron boots. It's not very long and has good flow since you can start one direction and loop around. The reward for completing the dungeon is essentially useless, especially if you're not playing on SOH, the ice arrows. If you're playing on an actual cartridge or the 3DS remake, all these arrows do is freeze certain enemies for a brief amount of time. Two notables are the moving spike things that litter certain dungeons, and Bongo Bongo's hands, which actually have a unique animation you won't see otherwise. I don't have footage of either of these since I got the arrows long after they'd been useful, but it's still worth mentioning that there is use if you go out of your way to get them. What SOH adds makes them at least somewhat useful, though less so for vanilla play. Blue fire arrows. They're still called ice arrows, but with a check of a box, they now have the same properties as blue fire does. Getting them late into the game, all this means is I don't need to worry about having blue fire for one of Ganondorf's puzzles, but they make for an invaluable asset if you could get them before the ice cavern. The dungeon also just shares its music track with caves in Dodongo's cavern, so sad to say, we won't even have unique music to listen to while traversing it. I would have at least liked it to use the Spirit Temple's theme. I think that'd be a bit more fitting. That's not all there is though. Once you get Epona, you're able to take on a time trial back at Lon Lon Ranch. Completing it in under 50 seconds will reward you with a cow that gets delivered to your home in Kokiri Forest. How Malon was able to get it through without becoming lost is beyond me, but hey, it's neat. The race itself is deceptively difficult though. If you're not good at keeping to the center or don't approach a fence with enough speed for a jump, you may as well just skip a post and forfeit to try again. The timer is that strict. There's also a much shorter mask trading quest with the child where you borrow masks from the Happy Mask salesman and find people to sell them to. You only need to do 4 of the 8 masks, but doing so allows you to borrow all of them as you wish. In the original, these masks weren't super useful, but do have some utility. 2 of the masks are required to get upgrades to your Deku nuts and sticks. The skull mask prevents the flying enemies from attacking you for some reason, and the bunny ears prevent Stalfos from spawning in Hyrule Field at night if you're a child. The Mask of Truth allows you to talk to the gossip stones scattered around Hyrule, which, as the name suggests, will tell you gossip. These range from helpful tips such as, they say that it is against the rules to use glasses at the treasure chest shop in Hyrule Castle Town Market, or they say that there is a secret on the road that leads to Lake Hylia, to actual gossip such as, they say that contrary to her elegant image, Princess Zelda of Hyrule Castle is, in fact, a tomboy. They say that Gerudo sometimes come to Hyrule Castle Town to look for boyfriends. Or my personal favorite, they say that the treasure you can earn in the Gerudo's training ground is not as great as you would expect given its difficulty. Ultimately, I don't really care to do this since the only rewards are these masks, but thankfully with SOH I can just use the feature that makes it so the bunny hood actually works like in Majora's Mask and makes doing the side quest much more valuable. There's even an option to allow them to be used as an adult so you can enjoy the speed boost regardless of age. Of course, one of the lengthiest things you'll have to do is collect all 100 golden Skulltula tokens. You stop getting decent rewards at 50, which is easy enough to come across just playing normally and grabbing all that you see. When going for all 100, however, it can be quite frustrating to pick up the last few. Thankfully, there's a feature in the game that puts a little icon next to an area on the map if you've collected every one in there, but the problem becomes when you need to start dungeon delving to get the remaining few. The dungeons have this feature as well, but you need to first enter the dungeon as this icon is displayed on the map. If you don't know which ones you've forgotten, then it's a ton of backtracking just to find it. Even worse, you still have to actually traverse through the dungeons to find the missing tokens. It's not so bad if you remember where they are, but if you're unsure of which ones you missed, then get ready to go through it all again. I said it earlier, but you're better off stopping at 50 at the most, since collecting any more beyond that is pointless unless you're looking for bragging rights. There are a couple other mini games that can be done as an adult as well. I believe I already mentioned the adult shooting gallery, but there's another archery test with horse archery, which is available after going through the Gerudo Fortress. I used to struggle like crazy with this one. There's 2 different target points, 1000 and 1500. Doing so nets you another quiver upgrade as well as a piece of heart. I don't usually bother as consumables are not hard to come by in this game. The game consists of your horse running down a path and back again, all while you need to hit some targets to score points. Depending on where you hit the target, you get more points, with a bullseye being worth 100. There are also a few pots set up that are a one-time target, but they're also worth 100 points each, so it's very much worth it to take them out. I don't think I ever did it on the 3DS, so I can't say for certain, but I know simply having the aiming reticle and competent gyro controls would have helped immensely. Here, I managed to complete it with little issue due to SOH having the option to add a reticle for the bow, and the sensitivity just worked out better for me. You can also return to the fishing spot where all the fish have grown over the last 7 years, and snagging a fish bigger than the one you got as a child will net you the golden scale, which extends your diving time. This doesn't really let you do much you couldn't do, but it is required for one piece of heart from the diving in the laboratory. By far, the worst side activity in the game has to be the big Poe hunting. In the guard post by Castletown's drawbridge, there's this guard who's bored out of his mind and basically gives you permission to smash up all the pots because it would be fun. After Ganondorf comes through, the guard post has been taken over by this creepy person who's into collecting Poes. I'm pretty convinced it's the same guy. After you defeat a Poe, it drops the lantern it carries and you can bottle it up. You can either eat it, which can actually hurt you, or you can sell it to this guy for some cash. The main objective is to sell big Poes to him, and each will get you 100 points. You need a total of 1,000 to get his reward, which means you need to sell him 10 big Poes. Here's the catch. There are only 10 big Poes. They're found in certain areas of Hyrule Field and will flee upon spawning in. You have to quickly shoot them twice, then collect their soul in an empty bottle. It sounds easy enough, but these guys move so fast, and if they so much as brush against a solid object, they will vanish and you have to run around until they spawn again. Even having an understanding of where they spawn, whether they choose to or not, seems a bit random. On top of that, some of them are in devious locations. There's one in this cramped area by the Gerudo Valley that has a chance to spawn already touching a wall, which means that it will just vanish as soon as it arrives. Sometimes they spawn and then the direction they head in gives you no time to actually get to them before they vanish. Then there are a couple that require you to take fast shots as the location they spawn in prevents you from actively giving chase since your direct path is blocked and going around would take too long. The reward for gathering all of them? Another bottle. Yep, your reward is the final bottle. Don't get me wrong, it's still just as useful as the other 3 bottles, but it's one of those things where at this point I truly have no need for it. Ultimately, it just ends up as being another vessel for a fairy, but frankly, I'd rather not go through the effort. Maybe it's just me, but with how long it takes to do this and the frustration it causes, it's just not worth the effort, especially since it's another one of those quests where there's no point in even gathering one, since the only reward is at the very end. That about wraps up the last few bits before the castle. If you did decide to collect everything, then Link at this point may as well be a god. So many consumables, you'll have no idea what to do with them all. 20 hearts, which equates to 80 hit points. 4 bottles, which you're probably storing fairies in for an extra 4 lives. And once you collect the golden gauntlets from inside the castle, they can be used to clear this giant pillar from the Great Fairy outside that will grant you double defense, giving you in effect 40 total hearts since enemies' damage are now cut in half. Before Ganondorf can be challenged though, we do need to head to this castle and gain entrance to the main tower. After we get all the medallions, we meet Sheik in the Temple of Time who reveals that he was, in fact, Zelda all along. She gives us the light arrows, but shortly after is captured by Ganondorf. We head to his castle where the power of the sages activate to create a very flashy rainbow bridge that allow us to gain entrance. The main challenge is right here in the ground floor. There are 7 rooms that must be beaten in order to remove the barrier from the tower. Each room represents one of the medallions we've gathered, though a couple clearly are based on cut content. For example, the Forest Temple sees Link primarily dealing with wind, and you make use of the hover boots to grab the silver rupees. I don't know about you, but I never got any sort of wind theme out of the Forest Temple. It does at least take on the appearance of the Forest Temple, and there is one lone wolf in this first room. The Water Temple room has nothing to do with water, but instead is more based on the challenges presented to you in the Ice Cavern of all things. It's not too difficult, and does allow me to make use of the Ice Arrow bonus effects from SOH. The Shadow Temple room has absolutely nothing to do with the Shadow Temple beyond aesthetic, and that's a crying shame. It could really have put up a much greater use of the Lens of Truth, maybe give us more difficult maze or secret switches hidden behind invisible walls. Sadly, it's just used to reveal a slightly curved path that has a switch to open the door. At least this is where you get the golden gauntlets, so time to grab that double defense. Next area is the Fire Temple room, and it's not fun, but it does in fact make use of an item you wouldn't normally expect. This middle platform will begin to sink when Link stands on it, unless you use the hover boots. Doing so makes it so the platform won't fall, and allows you to get around it with much less stress, as touching the lava will reset the room and put you back at the entrance. It also helps to make the last long shot, as you will need to be standing on it to get the correct angle. The light room is nothing special. The first room is filled with invisible enemies that need to be defeated for a chest to spawn with a key inside. The next room requires you to play Zelda's Lullaby, so a chest will spawn with a key inside. Frankly, it feels like the devs just didn't know what to do with this trial, so they filled it with something. The third room is another collect the silver rupees room, but you need to avoid some boulders, and after that, you're done. The last trial on the list is the Spirit Temple room, which starts with another silver rupee challenge, followed by the only time a bomb chew is required, which you'd be forgiven if you forgot they even existed, and then you need to reflect light to the correct sun to open the door. If you're on SOH, there's an option to let the light arrows trigger the sun switches, which gives them some extra utility beyond being required for the final fight. Clearing all the challenges removes the barrier, and we can proceed up the tower. The tower itself is just a gauntlet of increasingly difficult enemies, all the while Ganondorf is up top playing his organ that gets louder and louder the closer you approach. It starts with the Zalfos, then Stalfos, and finally dual Iron Knuckles that, as long as you don't hit both, can easily be taken down one at a time. It's time to take on the big man himself, Ganondorf. When you enter his room, Ganondorf gives the typical bad guy speech about how you've played right into his hand. He wants the Triforce, and now that you're here, it's time to complete it, and all he has to do is defeat you. He starts by blasting you with some purple ray that I never understood what it did other than make Navi complain. He then makes his organ vanish, proving that in some capacity he is a bard, and the fight begins with Ganondorf punching the ground and knocking the floor down to the room below. Once you're clear, he begins a game of energy tennis. Unlike the fight with Phantom Ganon, this one can't be cheesed by standing underneath him, you actually have to send it back with good timing. Luckily, the attack will just go right back to him instead of randomly going off course. The longer the volley, the faster it gets until either you or Ganondorf mess up. He hurts, so make sure you don't miss your attack. After Ganondorf is stunned, you need to quickly shoot him with a light arrow so you can do damage. After enough damage is dealt, Ganondorf can use another attack where he gathers up a bunch of power and sends a ton of energy balls at you at once. This attack can be deflected with a well-placed spin attack, but it's much easier to just shoot him with a light arrow as he is completely vulnerable during the charge. After he is defeated, he lets out a bloody gasp and collapses to the floor. Zelda is freed from her crystal prison, but the fight's not over yet. With his last ounce of strength, Ganondorf begins to cause the castle to crumble in an attempt to take our hero with it. Truly if I can't win, no one wins kind of effort. This part can be pretty stressful. You have to follow Zelda as she is able to open these gates that block the way. The whole segment is on a time limit, which is pretty forgiving, but I do remember failing a few times my first playthrough. Along the way, there will be a couple points where you get stopped and need to quickly dispatch some enemies. Debris constantly falls down on you, and you need to dodge it or risk taking chip damage. The last part is particularly brutal, as you need to get past a lone Redead who blocks the narrow bridge. It's not all that bad, unless you're just barely beating the clock, as those few seconds where it can stun you could make or break it. One final gate, and we manage to escape the castle. As the two watch it crumble, there's the smallest sense of hope that it's over until a strange noise is heard in the rubble. Link approaches, and it begins what is still, to this day, my favorite final fight in any Zelda game. Ganondorf erupts from the rubble. His anger has completely overtaken him. This is no longer about getting the Triforce, ruling over Hyrule, or even seeking a better life for his people. He simply wants Link dead. Without a word, he summons the full might of the Triforce of Power and transforms into Ganon in what is one of the most intimidating openers to a final fight there is. Between the music, the darkened skies, and the roar of Ganon himself as he swings his sword wildly, you can tell the man has lost all sense of humanity, and what we're left with is a beast that needs to be put down. The first phase is done without the Master Sword. Luckily, Ganon is weak to nearly anything in our arsenal, which includes Deku Nuts. His weak point is in his tail, and getting there risks getting slashed, which as you would expect is the single most damaging attack in the whole game. Even having full health, Ganon can pose a threat if you get too cocky. After taking enough damage, Ganon goes down, temporarily dropping the flame barrier, allowing Link to get the Master Sword. The second phase is largely the same, except Ganon moves a lot faster and recovers from being hit just the same. After enough swings, Link is finally able to subdue the beast, letting Zelda stun him, allowing for the satisfying final blow. Ganon recoils in pain, and the sages are able to finally seal him away for all eternity. Ganondorf then spends the rest of his life floating away in the Squidward dimension and cursing Link, threatening to take his revenge. Zelda bids Link goodbye, then he places the Master Sword back in his pedestal, where I guess having sealed away Ganon in the future prevents him from doing anything in the past. This part is a bit unclear, but the end of the credits has Link show up in the garden with Zelda, so I suppose if Ganondorf is still around, he could be arrested here. But then that begs the question of why couldn't Link have just gone back from the beginning? But honestly, that doesn't matter to me. What matters is at the end of the day, Ganon is sealed away, and the people of Hyrule are free to rejoice as they sing and dance around Lon Lon Ranch. All except Mido and King Zora, who get the short end of the stick in all this. Mido loses his friend, which is sad, but poor King has to contend with the loss of his own daughter. They aren't exactly dead, but since they've been awakened as the sages of the realm, they aren't coming back. We do get a nice shot of them all standing atop Death Mountain, which implies they can exist outside the Chamber of Sages, but I have to wonder if this means that they can go and visit their family and loved ones, or if they're forever cursed to just watch from a sacred realm as destiny has stripped any semblance of home from their lives. It's a bittersweet ending for sure. We accomplished our overall goal of stopping Ganondorf. Link wins, Hyrule wins, but not everyone within Hyrule wins. And that wraps up Ocarina of Time. A very beloved title, with many still considering it to be a perfect game and the best in the series. I'm sure with all my nitpicking I did, you probably guessed that I don't believe it's a perfect game, especially since such a game just doesn't exist. In fact, most of my nitpicks are non-issues on any standard playthrough I'd do, so why even bring them up if I wouldn't normally bother going for a full 100% playthrough? Honestly, part of it has to do with the fact that while I normally don't bother, the content is still there. There are people out there who will attempt to fully complete any game they play, and even then there are people who will still try it all even if they don't do it all. I was able to get through the entire Gold Skulltula quest because I know where all 100 of them are. Imagine collecting, say, 70 of them, and you struggle to find the last 30. You could realistically spend hours combing areas, constantly having to play the sun song just to make sure you get the ones that only spawn at night. You could also look up a guide, but then you'd likely see what the final reward is, and I think most people would see it as worthless as I do. Imagine spending hours on something just to find out you've wasted a bunch of time collecting something you don't even need. There's a lot of moving back and forth across the world, and unless you're moving towards story progression, it just might not be worth it for some. That doesn't mean I dislike the game, far from it. The story is just as simple as it ever is, but it does quite a lot to build on the world itself. We get a more in-depth explanation of the three goddesses and the Triforce as a whole. Unlike the previous titles, it's all explained in-game as well, making it so you don't have to rely on supplementary material to get the full story. The story was never hard to figure out, but I like how the game explains everything and provides us with the necessary details while only stopping slightly too long to go over some of it. I really don't think we needed the second scene about the goddesses since the first one explained what they were all about. Ganondorf has much more of a presence in this one, and his imposing nature is stronger than ever. The areas in the game are much more exciting and filled with little details that make me want to know more. The dungeons being in 3D now allows for more depth to them, and the puzzles, while still relatively simple, do have a bit more going on for them. The items you get are still a bit situational, but all the classics are here, such as bombs, arrows, and the ever-popular hookshot. This is the first Zelda game in a 3D environment, and the growing pains are ever present. But these are solid building blocks that Nintendo will learn from and use to improve future installments. It may be the simplest 3D Zelda game, but it is still truly an excellent adventure. I just recommend that if you never played it, give it a go on the 3DS or with Ship of Harkinian, since there's almost no reason to go back to the original other than nostalgia. But I'm sure anyone watching this has probably played this 100 times over. You love the game, but maybe once or twice you just want a slightly different experience. Well... luckily, there's an option for that. Zelda Randomizer. It's what it sounds like. Any and all items you can get in the game are removed from their vanilla locations and randomly placed around Hyrule. You could open a chest and find a piece of heart. Maybe instead of having useless junk, Mido's hiding the Megaton hammer. Shops are randomized too. Perhaps Ruto's letter is being held by the treasonous shopkeeper in Zora's domain. All is possible and more with the randomizer. At this point, you can do this with nearly any Zelda game, even Zelda 2. But I figured I'd talk about it here since it's the one I've done the most and is basically the reason I am able to 100% the game in the first place. There are many different randomizers out there, but the two prominent ones are the one built into SOH, and the most known one is the online generator over at ootrandomizer.com. Using either of these, there are a plethora of options you can choose to adjust your randomizer experience to both playstyle and skill level. This video is long enough as is, so I'll briefly go over some of the options. You can choose whether you want to start as a child or an adult. You can decide if the door of time begins open or not. You can set what you actually need to get to the Rainbow Bridge to appear before Ganon's castle, or even just have it always be there if you want. You can shuffle certain entrances, or all of them if you want, even amongst themselves, so what was once the entrance to a shop may in fact become a dungeon. You can adjust what type of item checks are in the game, such as randomizing all 100 golden Skulltulas into the pool. Maybe you don't want to bother fighting Ganon, you can set it to Triforce Hunt, where the objective to win becomes finding a set number of Triforce pieces, and the list goes on and on. As long as you play with a glitchless logic, you won't have to worry about having an impossible seed, as it will place all items in locations where they can be reached. This ensures you don't end up with something such as the Mirror Shield being the boss reward for Twin Rova. If you wondered why I had a bunch of stupid nitpicks, this is the reason for it. Since you'll be tackling certain obstacles in a way that weren't meant to be, it will lead to having to deal with certain things in ways that are simply annoying. It's most prevalent with a Skulltula hunt, where you go nearly the entire game without finding the Sun Song, and let me tell you, that is going to happen a lot if you don't give it to yourself from the beginning. But that's still a self-imposed challenge. You don't need to include the Skulltulas if you don't want to, and like I said, it could be tailored to your own unique desires to make it easier or harder. Just be aware that in theory, if the game does you dirty enough, it could actually end up making the journey much longer than a standard playthrough. So be prepared to sit down for multiple sessions, especially if you turn on more of the entrance options. If you made it through this massive rant of a video, I thank you very much. I'm still working on how exactly to structure my thoughts, especially with games I'm super passionate about, but I knew in my heart that this was always going to be a diarrhea of the mouth sort of deal. I spent the better part of a month working on the script alone, and there's honestly a lot more I could probably throw in here, but the line has to be dropped somewhere. If you skipped ahead just to see what I think about this game, then just know that regardless of how I speak about it, I will always love this title. I asked Link's Awakening video if it was a good starting point. It's only fair to ask here, and the answer is an overwhelming yes. Ocarina of Time is, in my opinion, the best place to start with the Zelda franchise, at least as far as 3D games are concerned. It's not too overbearing with anything, and the shortcomings are likely only to bother those who find themselves playing through the game multiple times, or those who choose to do 100%. It's not perfect, but the highs definitely outshine the lows. Thank you all for listening to my opinions on The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. I hope you enjoyed it, and have a fantastic rest of your day.